The self-defense claim is used in a lot of cases when victims are faced with imminent danger. Seeing how tricky self-defense cases can be based on the presentation of evidence and proving the actions of everyone involved, the verdict can be hard to deliver. When Victoria Rickman called the police in a panic and confessed that she'd attacked her ex-fiancé in self-defense, it seemed simple enough. But as the investigation unfolded, unimaginable things surfaced, and when a true crime reality TV show got into the mix of this mess, the case turned into one of the most sensational coverages ever. Was Victoria truly scared for her life on that unlucky Friday the 13th of September 2013? Or was there something more sinister lurking in the trenches? William Carter Jr., better known simply as Will, was born on October 7, 1982, in Phoenix, Arizona, to parents William James Carter Sr. and Carol Carter. Not too long after his birth, the family moved from Phoenix to Orlando and stayed there until 1988, after which the family made the move to Atlanta, Georgia, and called it their home. It's also here where the rest of the case takes place. Will was defined as a friendly, calm, gentle, and athletic person through and through. He played football and baseball in high school, a ton of golf with his father, and developed a deep passion for surfing while in Orlando. After graduating from high school, Will enrolled in the College of Charleston, and after he graduated from college, he worked multiple jobs over the next 10 years to figure out what he really wanted to do. Eventually, Will founded Georgia Select Insurance Company in Marietta, and he served as the CEO of the auto insurance company that he created from the ground up in 4 years. He was a successful businessman, as a startup grew to 5 offices and 30 employees during this time. But Will wasn't the type of CEO to boss everyone around. He was a hardworking and friendly person who worked with his employees almost 12 hours a day. Will had a contagious smile and was great at entertaining a room. While all of this was happening, Will had also been married and had a daughter, Lily, who he adored with every inch of his life. The marriage, though, soon fizzled out and the couple got divorced, but remained on good terms for the sake of their daughter. Will's life wasn't smooth by any means. He struggled with substance abuse, which unfortunately caused a couple of run-ins with the police. But after 10 years, he decided to turn his life around, went into rehab, and came out completely sober. While running his business and spending time with his daughter and the family, Will hardly had time for himself. But soon he met Victoria Rickman, better known as Tori, a woman who came in and changed his life forever. Not a lot is known about Tori's childhood, but what we do know is that she jumped into marriage with a man quite early on in her life, and things were anything but perfect. There were numerous allegations of abuse from both sides, and unsurprisingly, the marriage ended in divorce. The only good thing that came out of this marriage was Victoria's son, who was her pride and joy. Victoria's father, Paul, and close friends defined her as a great woman and an attentive mother. In 2010, Will and Victoria met through mutual friends, and a romance budded after bonding on being single parents, as well as their other interests. To call the relationship a whirlwind is an understatement, because shortly after, the couple got engaged and they moved in together. Their respective children, who were of the same age group, also went along with each other, so things seemed to be perfect. Until they weren't. The relationship between Will and Victoria, as quickly as it escalated, soon came tumbling down, and fights were breaking out right, left, and center. During the 3-year tumultuous relationship, Victoria made multiple physical abuse allegations against Will. She documented the injuries and showed them to her friends, who were understandably concerned for her safety. But that's not all. Throughout the relationship, Will and Victoria collected a huge list of police reports against each other, ranging from domestic violence to battery. Will and Victoria's relationship took a very toxic turn, and after some time, they decided to end the engagement. But with the relationship being as bad as it was, both Will and Victoria seemed to reconcile, break up, and repeat. But things came to a serious and fatal head on the fateful day of the 13th of September, 2013. To imagine that this event took place on Friday the 13th makes this case one of the more eerie criminal occurrences. But on September 13th, 2013, 30-year-old Victoria was staying over at a friend's house on Clifton Road in DeKalb County, Georgia. when at 2:30 a.m. she called the Atlanta PD reporting that she had shot her ex-fiancé.
Tried to rape me again, and I tried to ask him to stop, and I shot him.
You shot him?
Yes, I shot him.
Will, in an act of self-defense, as he allegedly tried to force himself on her. Victoria claimed that she didn't mean to take his life, she just wanted to stop his forceful advances. The responding officers arrived at the scene, led by Detective Summer Benton. Benton initially believed Victoria's statement, thinking that she'd actually acted on pure fight-or-flight instinct. But when her team arrived on the scene, she got more than one surprise of the night, and it's safe to say that things got messy from this point on. Because it turns out Benton's team was being trailed by the crew of Inside Homicide, a true crime television series, and they started to film the investigation from start to finish without so much as asking the team or the people involved for permission. But this aside, when Benton arrived at Victoria's house with a TV crew close behind, suspicions were already starting to rise against Victoria and her seemingly frenzied statement of self-defense. For starters, Victoria was standing outside the house wearing her pajamas, with her hair washed, holding her dog. Even more alarming was the fact that there weren't any injuries on Victoria's body. Furthermore, the house didn't seem in disarray or show any signs of forced entry, as Victoria stated in the call. To put it simply, this just looked like an ordinary night for the couple. Literally nothing suggested anything untoward had previously taken place, other than the crime scene in the bedroom. Upon entering the bedroom, officers discovered a disrobed Will on the bed who had passed away from 9 rounds being fired at him. He was only 30 years old. On the nightstand of Will's side of the bed, his gold watch was sitting undisturbed, and a gold chain that he always wore was clutched in his left hand. Will's clothes were discarded on the floor, but other than that, the room didn't look like there'd been a fight or a struggle, if you don't count the toppled-over lamp and noise machine on the nightstand of Victoria's bedside. Shortly after, Will's body was taken for an autopsy after breaking the news of the passing to his parents, who were struck with immense grief. Meanwhile, Victoria had been taken to Grady Hospital for a medical examination for assault. Surprisingly, although there were signs that Victoria and Will had been intimate with each other, there weren't any injuries or trauma that could say for certain that she was forced to engage in activities against her will. When Detective Benton got the news, her suspicions got even more concrete, and now Victoria went from a defenseless woman to the prime suspect in Benton's eyes. As the crime scene was being combed, officers also recovered the firearm that Victoria used inside the nightstand drawer farthest from Will. It was a .40 caliber semi-automatic firearm with 4 rounds inside. There were also 9 bullet casings scattered throughout the room. Remember this detail because we'll get back to that in a moment. The detectives created a simulation of what might have happened on the night of Will's passing, and it was believed that Will had his back to Victoria when she fired at him, causing him to fall onto the bed, where the rest of the rounds were fired and led to Will's tragic demise. Now, let's get back to Victoria. After the hospital examination, she was taken straight to the police station, where Detective Benton questioned her. Victoria started by maintaining her innocence, saying that she merely acted in self-defense and that she did nothing wrong. She also went on to say that Will had allegedly been forceful with her in the past, but he never got in trouble with the law. But before the interrogation could go any further, Victoria refused to answer any more questions without a lawyer. She also underwent an examination for her injuries, and her body was photographed for evidence. Something that was particularly bizarre during the interrogation is that a small scuffle broke out in the interrogation room between Victoria and Detective Benton, as the detective was trying to take Victoria's phone as evidence. This whole situation was just weird. Finally, almost 7 hours after Will's passing, as the interrogation came to an end, Victoria received the news. She wasn't walking out of that interrogation room as a free woman. Rather, she was being charged and arrested for taking the life of her ex-fiancé. Victoria's reaction to the news was especially chilling. She lacked emotion, was indifferent, and wasn't even trying to plead her innocence or make a scene. But it wasn't enough to take the case to trial, though. Detectives knew if they wanted to get to the bottom of this case, they were going to have to go elbow deep. And all this digging is about to open up a whole other can of worms. To piece the story together, Detective Benton reached out to Will's parents, who were understandably still mourning after learning about their son's sudden passing. But the revelations that came forward were mind-boggling, to say the least. Right off the bat, Will's parents, Will Sr. and Caro, were furious at Victoria for slandering Will and suggesting he'd even been remotely violent towards her. They urged that the whole self-defense stance was devised by Victoria and revealed that she was the abusive one in the relationship. This claim was backed up by an incident that occurred in January of 2012, more than a year before Will's passing. Will was visiting his parents when they noticed a huge bleeding injury behind his ear and what looked like teeth marks on his shoulder. Will claimed that Victoria had attacked him, and then she proceeded to bite him on the shoulder after a very heated argument. I mean, who even does that? On another occasion, Will Sr. explained how Victoria had struck Will in the head with a heavy object, again claiming self-defense, and showed marks on her wrists as proof of the violence to the police. Surprisingly, Will got arrested on battery, although the charge was dropped by Victoria shortly after and she confessed that she made up the claims. Despite all of this and his parents' warnings, Will tried to reconcile with Victoria, but there was more. 2 weeks later, Will's parents got to know just how rageful Victoria was when she didn't get what she wanted. Understandably, Will's parents didn't want Victoria in their home because they felt like their son was in danger. Victoria, in a fit of rage, straight up told them that she was well armed and didn't have to do what they told her to do. And if you thought this was a dramatic escalation, then this next bit will stun you to no end, because Victoria seemed to be on a roll. In May of 2013, just 4 months prior to the devastating passing of Will, Victoria broke into Will's home in Cobb County and pulled him around the house by his gold chain necklace, demanding to know if he'd been talking to someone behind her back. When Will tried to make her leave, Victoria proceeded to run around the neighborhood, screaming that Will had forced himself on her. When the police arrived at the scene, Victoria turned the tables on Will, alleging that he'd violated her, even though he'd apparently done nothing wrong. That didn't work out in Victoria's favor, though, because she was the one who ended up getting charged with battery. And get this, these charges were still looming over her head when Will lost his life, so Victoria was most likely not going to be let off easy. It was pretty clear from these events that Victoria was the aggressor in the relationship, and even Will's parents believed that she was malicious. Heartbreakingly enough, Will couldn't see for himself, and he truly wanted to mend the relationship. On the other side, Victoria's friends had completely different opinions of Will, and according to them, he was the one who allegedly subjected Victoria to violence. Brittany Morgan, Victoria's best friend, had a lot to say about the relationship between Will and Victoria, and it wasn't nice. Brittany painted Victoria as a woman who had constantly had her boundaries violated in the past, and with Will it wasn't any different. Brittany claimed that Will was manipulative, violent, and very harsh with Victoria, and she even saw the injuries on Victoria's body. In fact, Brittany encouraged her to document the injuries for evidence. To add to that, Brittany was convinced that on the night of September 13th, Victoria was backed into a corner and that she didn't have any option left but to attack Will viciously. To add fuel to the fire, Will's past drug charges were also dragged into this mess, even though they were totally unrelated. Will's parents had been nothing but forthcoming about their son's struggles, and when he made a turn in his life for the better, they couldn't have been more proud of him. But Victoria and her friends seemed to believe otherwise, and strongly held on to the fact that Will was a terrible person and that Victoria was trying her hardest to leave the relationship. In May of 2013, Victoria filed for a restraining order against Will in Cobb County Court. There, she met with Sheriff's Deputy Frederick Price, who was on duty while the rest of the office was closed. He took one look at Victoria, saw her injuries, and wrote up a restraining order on the spot. Not only this, Price was extra concerned for her safety and gave Victoria his personal .40 caliber semi-automatic firearm for protection, and even took her to a shooting range for practice. Coincidentally, this was the same firearm used on Will the night of the attack. By this point, things started getting messy beyond measure, and after all of these details surfaced, the pivotal question reared its head. Who was guilty and who was innocent? Will or Victoria? While being held in jail awaiting her trial, Victoria requested bail, which was obviously denied. To add to the mess and divide opinions and the community even more, Inside Homicide came out with their episode on the real-life saga of Will and Victoria. Their main focal point was Detective Benton's investigation, and a narrative was drawn that Victoria, a divorced temptress, was guilty of Will's murder, even before the case went to court for trial. Now, this was wrong on so many levels. For starters, imagine the hurt and emotional trauma Will's family and friends relived. It was insensitive to turn a real-life crime into a source of entertainment, especially when Will's parents were crestfallen at the loss of their son. It's one thing to cover a case after a verdict has already been announced, but to go behind the backs of the families, the investigators, and everyone is just downright dangerous, considering the investigation was still actively underway at that time. The families wanted the case to be handled by the law, based on evidence, not see it get glorified and blown out of proportion on TV screens. Since the TV and entertainment industry was sadly jumping on the reality show bandwagon with no consideration for Will or his family, reporter Erin Moriarty from 48 Hours reached out to Will's family, Victoria, and everyone involved for an interview before the trial, though Victoria basked in the limelight of the attention and stood by her innocence. See, Victoria claimed that on the fateful night of September 13th, Will had apparently relapsed and was acting strangely. But this claim couldn't be corroborated because on the night of the crime, Detective Benton didn't request Will's toxicology and blood alcohol report, so no one knew what Will had in his system when he passed away. Benton, quick to her defense, said that since it was her first case in DeKalb County, she simply didn't know that she had to request those things specifically. Even though Will's blood was taken in as evidence, it was later destroyed since there was apparently no need for a toxicology report, or so they thought at the time. Fast forward to August 22nd, 2017, nearly 4 years after the tragic passing of Will, and the case finally went to trial. It lasted 2 weeks, and Victoria's defense attorney, Amanda Palmer, was head-to-head with Sheila Ross, one of Georgia's most renowned prosecutors. As expected, the trial was anything but smooth, with both sides trying to convince the jury with their respective evidence. The prosecution alleged that Victoria had premeditated the entire thing, and Will's demise was anything but an instinctual fight-or-flight response. The defense, on the contrary, presented Victoria as a woman suffering from PTSD, and that a stronger, taller, and abusive man was violating her. Victoria's friends also testified in court, obviously in her favor. The defense also called Will's psychiatrist, Dr. John Lockridge, onto the stand, who divulged a peculiar detail about Will. He testified that Will called 3 days before his demise, stating that he was having delusions of being famous on TV. See, Will was on antidepressants to help with sleep issues, a fact that Dr. Lockridge confirmed. But since Detective Benton never requested a toxicology report, we can never know what medications were in Will's system, if there were any, and whether they could have influenced his mental state at the time of his passing or not. On the second day of the trial, Detective Benton took the stand and gave her version of events, and yet another pivotal revelation was made. Remember the rounds that were fired at the crime scene? Well, Summer Benton, a seasoned detective with over 16 years of experience under her belt, made a big-time mistake. She believed that the .40 caliber weapon used in the attack against Will had been reloaded, since there were 9 casings on the floor of the crime scene and 4 in the magazine. Benton thought that the weapon only held 12 rounds. Her theory all along was that if Victoria had reloaded the weapon, the self-defense claim wasn't valid anymore, since she clearly had every intention of ending Will's life that night, a detail which was aired on TV. But the weapon's capacity was actually 13 rounds, so this small slip-up brought back the notion that Victoria's case could be that of self-defense, because she didn't reload the weapon. Surprisingly, Benton stood by her claim that she didn't make a mistake, and that her tiny moment of misinformation wasn't a big deal in the grand scheme of things. Regardless of this tiny sliver of hope for Victoria, the prosecution had more evidence up their sleeves to undermine Victoria's helpless facade. The prosecutor firmly believed that Victoria was a manipulative seductress who charmed men with her allure and made them fulfill her desires. To solidify this stance, Jeremy Fordham, a former acquaintance of Victoria's, was brought to court. According to Fordham, Victoria sent him explicit pictures of herself. He wasn't the only one Victoria had charmed with her sensuality, because Robbie Ray, a lieutenant from the county police department, had also exchanged suggestive texts with Victoria. What's shocking is that Frederick Price, the same deputy who'd given her his gun, was also called to the stand, and he confessed that he was interested in Victoria from the get-go, although their relationship never got intimate. If that wasn't staggering enough, it was revealed that Victoria contacted Price the night of September 13th after attacking Will, and he instructed her to call 911. Seeing his uncooperativeness in helping to solve the case, he was fired from his job 5 days after the fatal attack on Will. Another witness, William Plunkett, Victoria's former roommate, testified that upon eviction, she threatened to call the police and tell them that he had violated her. This woman just loved to pull the defenseless female card, and it's just sickening. The reason why so many people are afraid to speak out when something like this really does happen is because people like Victoria have given these allegations a bad rap, because they just make things up in order to spite the men in their lives. It's just gross, and so many women are forced into silence because people don't believe them, all because of women like Victoria. But all this aside, prosecution had one last card up their sleeve, and honestly, they saved the most impactful bit for last, and that was Victoria's phone. Detective Kevin Leonpacher, who was responsible for the forensic investigation of Victoria's phone, came across a paper trail of evidence, 66,000 texts to be exact. And this discovery helped detectives to create a timeline of what happened on that dreadful night when Will passed away. It was revealed that Victoria had asked her friend, Andrew Scarr, that she needed his house, where she was staying temporarily, for herself that night. Scarr, not being suspicious, stayed at his mother's and left Victoria alone in his home. Shortly after, Victoria called Will, and although it's unknown what they were talking about, Will showed up at Victoria's house after midnight. Detectives speculated that Victoria had called Will to meet at her house. The recovered data list also included texts from Will being furious with Victoria for contacting his ex-wife, with Will calling Victoria the quote, love of his life. There were even conversations between Frederick Price, the former police officer, and a panicked Victoria because she believed that the battery charges pressed by Will in May of 2013 were going to affect her son's custody case. In Victoria's phone gallery, detectives hit another jackpot. There were many pictures of her injuries, which seemed fine at first considering she was a supposed victim of violence. But what wasn't normal was the time when these were taken. It was exactly a day before the fatal attack on Will. The detectives concluded that this was her plan all along to get away with the attack. Now, I don't know about you, but if this isn't premeditation, I don't know what is. And combine that with the fact that Will wasn't dropping the charges against Victoria for battery, well, there's a clear motive here. But there was one more eerie discovery the detectives made, and it threw Victoria's battered woman stance clear out the window. After alleging that Will had violated her in May of 2013, Victoria tried to barge into Will's house later that night while recording the incidents on her phone. Will, visibly surprised and scared, asked Victoria to leave and called her a toxic web of lies. Victoria, refusing to leave, egged him on to call the police on her. This video entailed that Victoria's behavior wasn't that of a scared woman suffering from aftershocks of PTSD and domestic violence, because, in all honesty, who in their right mind would want to meet the person who allegedly violated them just days earlier? As the trial came to an end on September 1st, 2017, the jury came forth with the verdict, and Victoria was found guilty. And this verdict was a much-needed closure for Will's family, and his parents thought that their son was finally at peace since justice was served. On October 5th, 2017, Victoria's sentencing was held, and throughout the trial, Victoria showed no remorse for ending Will's life, opted not to take the stand at the trial, and only got emotional when the defense presented her side of the story. Before the sentencing, Victoria pleaded with the judge for leniency, as she claimed to be a battered woman, a victim of PTSD and violence, and the mother of a child. Funny how she didn't feel the same way when she ended the life of a man who was also a loving and devoted father, and that she didn't think it was necessary to apologize to Will's family for their permanent loss. Victoria was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, plus 5 years for the weapons charge. Her appeals and motions since then have been denied, and she remains incarcerated at the Pulaski State Prison in Hopkinsville, Georgia. As for Will's parents, they're doing their best to move on while still reeling from the painful loss of their son. In memory of Will and paying homage to how amazing of a person he was, his friends and employees made a Facebook page called Remember Will Carter. It's a memory tag of sorts and a way to connect with Will because even though he's gone, many people will carry his memories forever. Will's daughter, Lily, remembers and misses her father every single day, lamenting that he'll never be there for when she accomplishes the many milestones in her life, but she says he's always in her heart. Will's mom, Caro, understands Lily's emotions fully and is saddened by the fact that Will won't be there when her daughter graduates or gets married. For Will's parents, Loki, his beloved senior dog, at the ripe age of 13, is another connection to their son. Will's had Loki since he was a puppy, and he gives Will's family some level of comfort and a sense of closeness to Will, and the drive to move on with their lives. This case was all sorts of crazy, and it just goes to show that things really aren't what they seem on the surface a lot of the time. If you're someone who's in a dangerous relationship, no matter if you're a man or a woman and trying to make things work, it's always best to reach out to others and let them know what you're dealing with. It's often the case that maybe you just can't see the forest for the trees. I'm a big believer that nearly every relationship can be saved, almost every single time. But in cases like this, it would have been far better if Will had just distanced himself from the situation as his parents had wished. I don't say that to cast even one single ounce of the blame on him. I merely say that because sometimes we just need to listen to the people around us when we know that they have our best interest in mind. Faith can be an incredible thing. For some people, it's the only thing that gets them through their day, while for others, it serves as a source of renewal and inspiration. But it can also be a very dangerous thing when faith is placed in the wrong person. Those of us who grew up in the church will know that ministers, elders, and deacons are held in high regard in their respective church families, since they're seen as the leaders of the church and are tasked with helping and guiding their congregation. But some of those who call themselves ministers of God, they're not at all what they seem. Matt Baker served as a Baptist minister at the Crossroads Baptist Church in Hewitt, Texas, back in 2006. He and his wife Kari were well known in their community, and from the outside, their marriage seemed perfect. The couple met while they were both still students at Baylor University in Waco, and they immediately hit it off. Just 3 months later, they would tie the knot at Kari's parents' house, and following this, Matt would attend the George W. Truett Theological Seminary at Baylor University, where he completed his studies to become a pastor. The future looked bright for the young couple, since they were both active in the church and had found happiness in each other. That joy would only grow when they had 3 daughters, Kinsey, Cassidy, and Grace. But things would take a tragic turn when Cassidy was diagnosed with a brain tumor in 1998. Once the tumor was found, she started receiving treatment that at first seemed promising, and she was released from the hospital. But in March of the following year, Matt found her unresponsive in her bedroom and realized she'd sadly passed away. And this understandably brought Kari's world crashing down around her. Due to the effect that the tragedy had on her, Kari started attending counseling sessions and would often remember her daughter by writing passages about her in her Bible. This, along with her faith and her 2 other daughters, kept her going during a time that many people would have found too hard to endure. But no one could have foreseen the events that were about to unfold in the family's household. It all started with a 911 call that Matt made a few minutes past midnight on the 8th of April, 2006. Matt told the operator that he left the house to get a movie and to put gas in his car. But when he returned, he was shocked to find Kari lying lifeless on their bed with a note and an empty bottle of sleeping tablets next to her. The note read, quote, "Matt, I'm so sorry. I'm so tired. I just want to sleep for a while. Please forgive me. Tell Kinsey and Grace that I love them very much. Please continue to be a great dad for our little girls. Love them every day for me. I'm sorry. I love you, Kari." He told the operator that he had tried to revive his wife, and when he realized that she wasn't breathing, and since she wasn't clothed, he started trying to dress her one hand at a time while speaking to 911 on the phone, which he had trapped between his ear and one of his shoulders. The operator then instructed him to start administering CPR, which he did, and when EMS arrived, they took over. But Kari was pronounced deceased when they were unsuccessful. Matt then supplied investigators with the details of what had happened that night. He stated that he left the house at around 11:10 p.m. because he wanted to rent a movie, and while he was out, he decided that he might as well get gas for the car. He was surprised when, upon his return, he found his and Kari's bedroom door locked, and she wouldn't answer when he knocked. He became concerned that something was wrong and grabbed a screwdriver, and he was able to lever the door open, and the door lock finally popped and he stepped inside. He found Kari lying on the bed with her arms outstretched. He then managed to dress her in a t-shirt and underwear while speaking to the 911 operator. To everyone at the scene, it seemed that Cassidy's passing had just been too much for Kari, something that most parents would never judge her for. Jim and Linda Doolin, Kari's mother and father, were informed of what had happened, and they raced over to the house in disbelief. They knew that Kari had been struggling, but never imagined that she would take her own life. But it wouldn't take long for their suspicions to be roused when Linda was told by her three sisters that Matt wasn't as clean-cut as he pretended to be. They knew of multiple women who Matt had made advances towards while serving as their minister, but they decided not to say anything since they didn't want to cause trouble in his and Kari's marriage. Since she was still in disbelief over the ruling that Kari had ended her own life, she decided to do some investigating, starting with Matt and Kari's cell phones that had just been added to her and Jim's plan. She immediately found something strange. In the weeks after Kari had passed away, Matt had been placing calls to her number. In one instance, he'd called that number 17 times, and in total, he had dialed it 180 times. She then found out that the phone was no longer in Matt's possession, since he'd given it to a member of his congregation, a woman named Vanessa Bowles. Linda then contacted Bill Johnston, a former assistant district attorney and assistant U.S. attorney who, along with U.S. Marshal Mike Nemera and Agent John Bennett, started their own investigation. They were able to confirm that Matt was somewhat of a ladies' man, since he'd made advances to women not only while he and Kari were married, but also while they were dating, and while he was still in college. As is often the case, things started to look even more suspicious when they checked Matt's internet history. He'd not only visited several adult websites, but more alarmingly, had performed searches for terms that alluded to taking someone's life with sleeping pills, as well as an overdose. He also researched how one would go about obtaining the sleeping pill Ambien without the need for a prescription. Everyone involved started to feel that something untoward was going on here, and the police had missed many details that pointed towards Kari's passing being a homicide rather than her taking her own life. Through much trial and effort, Johnson was able to eventually convince the authorities that there was a need to have an autopsy conducted. And 3 months after that tragic night, this was finally done. And the results were interesting. Since so much time had passed, it would have been impossible to find medications in Kari's blood. But the results showed that she had a type of sleeping medication called Unisum in her muscle tissue. This can be purchased over the counter. Ambien, the drug that Matt had researched, was also found, which was strange since Kari was never known to have taken that particular pill. Following these findings, the ruling was changed to an undetermined cause of death. Not only were there inconsistencies as far as Kari's passing was concerned, but there were now also rumors that Matt had been having an affair with Vanessa Bowles, to whom he'd gifted his wife's phone. Investigators realized that everything was not as it seemed, and they started suspecting that Matt may have ended Kari's life. He was arrested in September of 2007 and charged with claiming the life of his wife, but thanks to his defense attorney, Guy James Gray, he was released on bond. Gray was certain that Matt was innocent, and on one occasion told a news outlet that he only accepts cases that he has absolute faith in. He believed that it would be impossible to establish the cause of Kari's passing, and that prosecutors would not be able to prove that this was a homicide. Linda was even more upset when she found out that the assistant district attorney had decided to drop all charges against Matt just 6 months later, since he felt that the evidence in the case was merely speculative, and that it could not be proven that a crime had been committed. But she refused to give up without a fight. She filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Matt. It would be a civil case, but she hoped that the authorities would uncover further evidence during their investigations, and that they would eventually be able to build a criminal case against him. Matt had to endure a deposition, during which he would be questioned under oath. Johnston later remarked that Matt could have opted to remain silent at this point, but likely because he wanted to make it seem like he had nothing to hide, chose to answer his questions instead. He denied ever having an intimate relationship with Vanessa Bowles or anyone else while married to Kari. But much of his testimony regarding the events of that night didn't seem to add up. He stated that while he was talking to the 911 operator, it took him mere seconds to dress his wife, despite the fact that she was unresponsive and that he had to do it mostly one-handed. But Matt's defense attorney still had the upper hand. All the evidence against Matt was circumstantial and speculative at best, and unless prosecutors were able to speak to Vanessa, it seemed likely the case wouldn't go much further. When investigators interviewed her on an earlier occasion, she admitted that she and Matt had been seeing each other, but insisted they only started doing so after Kari had passed away. But she'd failed to convince Linda and the prosecution. It had come to light that Matt and Vanessa had been seen at a jewelry store in the weeks after the incident, and that they'd been looking at wedding rings. It seemed implausible that they would consider getting married if they'd only been dating for such a short time. But stranger things have happened. They also found Vanessa's demeanor to be deceitful, either because she was lying or because she was withholding information that could prove detrimental to Matt's case. To get to the truth, Vanessa was ordered to testify in Matt's case, where she would come face to face with a grand jury. To ensure her full cooperation, Vanessa was told that she would not face any consequences as a result of her testimony. But she was told that if she was found to be lying under oath, she would be charged with perjury. When she finally appeared in court, she insisted that she had told the police the truth. But she would then suddenly make a startling confession when asked whether Matt had ever discussed that night with her. She confessed that during one of their meetings, he told her that he wanted to tell her what had happened, and that he would only do it this one time. After that, it would never be discussed again. His exact words to Vanessa were, "I killed her for you." When speaking with Vanessa about the crimes against Kari, he went into further detail, telling her that he'd emptied out a few of Kari's medication capsules and replaced their contents with Ambien. He then made sure that Kari took them, and when she started to get drowsy, he helped her to the bedroom. There, he handcuffed her to the bed, and she soon drifted off. He remembered that she started snoring, and this is when he enacted his plan. He kissed her on the forehead, told her to give Cassidy a hug for him, then started smothering her with the pillow. When his heinous act was complete, he uncuffed her and typed out the note that was found beside Kari, making sure to rub it on her hands so that her fingerprints would be present. He then staged the scene and left the house to ensure that he would have an alibi. The police officers who attended the scene never thought to check Matt's computer, which they soon discovered still contained the note that he had typed, and it was never confiscated as evidence. She also revealed that Matt had sent her an MP3 file of the All-American Rejects song Dirty Little Secret, and I think the implications are clear here. He told her to keep all of this information to herself lest she wanted to become his next regret. It should be noted that by this point, Matt and Vanessa were no longer dating, as she had already ended the relationship. Linda was elated at the news that so much information was gathered against Matt, and he was arrested once again in March of 2009. He was again charged with ending Kari's life, but this time the prosecution would have Vanessa on their side, something that would likely not have set well with Matt. It took about 4 years to get to this point, but for everyone who was close to Kari, the wait was well worth it just to see justice done. Matt continued to profess his innocence and insisted that he and Vanessa never had an affair. The court and everyone in attendance were expecting Matt and his defense attorney, Guy James Gray, to continue asserting that he never had been intimate with Vanessa. But to everyone's surprise, Gray stood up in court and proclaimed that he had been fooled by his client, who now admitted that he had cheated on his wife. He would later admit that this revelation took the wind out of his sails, and that he no longer wanted to defend Matt, since it went against his policy to defend someone that he didn't have 100% confidence in. He requested to be removed from the case, but Matt insisted that he remain with his lawyer, and the court agreed. He did state that just because Matt wouldn't initially own up to the fact that he'd been unfaithful, it didn't mean that he was guilty, though the fact that he'd been lying for almost 4 years painted him in a less than favorable light. Instead, he focused on Kari's depression after Cassidy passed away. He reiterated that she was using a mix of medications that included sleeping pills, and that this would have made it easy for her to end her own life. But we can't forget the fact that she was never prescribed Ambien specifically, even though Ambien was found to have been in her system. Furthermore, he reminded the jury that no cause of death had been established, and hence they couldn't convict anyone of claiming her life. But luckily, Matt wasn't the only one who was aware of Kari's state of mind. Many of her friends told investigators that although she was finding it hard to deal with her daughter's passing, she was no longer depressed. This was confirmed by her grief counselor, who'd also shared another detail from the case. During her testimony, Linda told the court that the grief counselor spoke to her one day and told her that Kari had found crushed up pills in Matt's suitcase. She also revealed that she was afraid of Matt, or rather, afraid that he was planning to harm her in one way or another. She questioned Matt about the pills, but he assured her that they didn't belong to him, and that they'd likely been put in his briefcase by one of the people present at a youth center where he worked. He told her that as soon as he realized they were in his briefcase, he reported it to the youth center's security, but no record of such a report was ever found. As the case continued, more and more of Matt's statements about that night just didn't seem to make sense, and it seemed as though his case was starting to fall apart. The prosecution then started focusing on his claims of what happened after he found Kari unresponsive. They expressed their doubts about his ability to not only dress Kari in just 4 minutes without any help, but also the fact that he'd performed CPR while talking to the 911 operator on his phone. He'd also stated that he found Kari lying on her back with her arms outstretched. But photos from the scene prove that lividity had already set in. This term means that a deceased person's blood has started to settle towards the lowest parts of their body. Since the photos show that more lividity had occurred on Kari's left arm, they suggested that this arm may have been hanging off the bed, which is contradictory to the way Matt claimed to have found her. The next witness to take the stand was a man who owned a website in Japan. He told the court that his online pharmacy section of his website was accessed by Matt before Kari's passing, and that he placed an order for Ambien, but that he failed to complete the transaction. The case had grown in intensity by this point. There was still no telling what the jury would decide, but the atmosphere in the courtroom was about to get even more intense, as the time had come for Vanessa to take the stand. When asked whether she had lied about having an affair with Matt, Vanessa immediately admitted that she had been untruthful. She then recounted meeting Matt in church one day in 2005. At the time, she was in the process of getting divorced and had been having a difficult time adjusting to life as a single mother. She went to church and was sitting by herself when Matt sat down next to her and they started talking. They would often meet up after that, and at times he would talk to Vanessa about Kari. He explained that she was growing ever more depressed and that she wasn't taking care of their children anymore. Given that he was her minister, Vanessa believed every word, and so didn't find it strange that he'd asked her to come to his house for counseling. While praying together, he took hold of her hands and kissed her, which caught her off guard, and she stated that this is when the affair started. He would then often tell her that he wanted Kari out of his life, and that he had, on several occasions, spoken about ways in which he could end her life without being caught. He considered drugging a milkshake, tampering with her car's brakes, or ending her life in a drive-by. He'd also spoken about making it seem as though she had taken too many sleeping pills. He'd even gone as far as to tell her what date on which he planned to end Kari's life, the 7th of April, 2006, since this was close to the date that Cassidy had passed away. Committing the act on this date would make it easy for him to claim that Kari had taken her own life since it was close to the anniversary of Cassidy's passing, and hence would make his claims that she was depressed more believable. Unfortunately, Vanessa kept all of this information to herself rather than reporting it to the police, and preventing Matt from claiming the life of his wife in the first place. It's a factor in this case that Linda still struggles to come to terms with, especially since Vanessa had been granted immunity and could not be charged for withholding such information. Vanessa claimed that she chose not to speak up because she was worried that no one would believe her, given Matt's position as a minister. She also didn't think that he would do the same thing to her, despite being told by him that she would become his next regret if she didn't keep his secret. In Matt's defense, Gray asked an expert witness about DNA found on the note that was found next to Kari. He testified that Kari's DNA was by far the most abundant, which indicated to the defense that she had indeed typed it and printed it out, since she would have handled the paper more than anyone else. Soon enough, the trial was over, and all that was left was for the jury to make their decision. They left the courtroom, and Linda, along with the prosecution, were hopeful that they would return quickly, since this is usually a good sign that a guilty verdict had been reached. But over the next 7 hours, their hopes started to fade, as the jury asked to see Matt's deposition video, a transcript of Vanessa's testimony, and for clarification on whether Matt could only be found guilty of drugging and suffocating Kari. As the defense had not decided to put Matt on the stand, the jury would have to rely on witness statements and those made by Vanessa, since the prosecution was not allowed to question him in court. Guy James Gray had lost all confidence in his client and was concerned that he would incriminate himself if he were to testify, since the prosecution had planned for Matt to reenact his actions that night with the use of a dummy that weighed about the same as Kari. Had this been done, he would undoubtedly have struggled to demonstrate dressing the dummy while on the phone, and his case would likely have fallen apart very quickly. But in the end, this made very little difference, as the jury eventually returned and announced that they had found Matt guilty of taking the life of Kari Baker. And even then, Matt claimed that they'd made a mistake, and that he truly believed in his own innocence. The verdict resulted in Matt being sentenced to 65 years behind bars, with the possibility of parole after serving a minimum of 32 years. This man most likely will never leave prison. In the years that have passed since the crime occurred, Linda and the rest of Kari's family have since forgiven Matt for what he did, since they realized that holding on to a grudge this big could only lead to further misery in their lives. Holding on to this level of resentment, it's like punching yourself and hoping someone else gets hurt. At some point, you just have to stop and admit that what is. They've made peace with the fact that Kari's passing could have been prevented by one person who knew of his plans, and the fact that she would ultimately face no consequences for withholding such valuable information. Linda and Jim have now been given custody of Kinsey and Grace, and they continue to live as a loving family in defiance of the heinous acts committed by a man who many people trusted as an advisor, a spiritual guide, and a mentor. This case is another shining example that just because someone claims to be a Christian, a minister of God's word, or any plethora of things, that doesn't necessarily mean they're a good person or that they're even being truthful. A person's true intentions are almost always seen in their actions, not their words. I've said it before, and I feel that it fits here as well. Matt was not a Christian man. Matt was not a man of God. He was a wolf in a sheep's den, and he was out for blood. To him, I say good riddance, and I hope with every fiber of my being that he's able to turn his life around in prison, but I think we all have to admit this is probably a long shot. Who would have imagined that a devoted wife and loving stepmother would vanish, leaving behind her loved ones? Katrina Smith was set for a big job interview on that fateful day. Excited about this new promotion, she shared the news with her family. But unfortunately, she never made it to the interview. Her colleagues called her husband, worried that their star employee was not at work that day. But here's the real shocker. Her husband didn't know where she was either. Panic set in and everyone asked, "Where's Katrina Smith?" Little did they know that they would uncover a shocking truth that no one could have expected. Katrina Smith was a 30-year-old wife and stepmother to 3 girls, ages 21, 18, and 16. She had 2 siblings, Miranda and Chad, who described her as the funniest woman they'd ever met. Katrina made growing up fun for them, and while at home she went on shopping trips with them or visited random eateries to try out new recipes. Her siblings could talk to her about anything and everything, and even though Chad didn't spend much time with the family, Katrina visited him often. She was friends with his wife and always gave him good advice. He was amazed at how much his younger sister knew. He admired her wisdom and kindness, and to Chad, Katrina was more than a member of the family, she was a true friend. Katrina worked with her husband Todd in insurance before working in the human resources department at Cameron Company in Belvedere. When Katrina wasn't working, she volunteered at Heartland Church. She had a bright, cheerful spirit that everyone noticed. She also enjoyed geocaching, a fun community game where you use a GPS to go on a small treasure hunt to find trinkets or hidden items. Katrina's family says that her smile was infectious and spread wherever she went. Katrina Smith lived in McChesney Park in Illinois. This town is part of a larger community of Rockford. Rockford's about 100 miles from Chicago and about 20 miles from the Wisconsin border, known for being a blue-collar community. When you visit this town, you'll see many industrial plants as you stroll along the river downtown. To locals, this is what the city is known for, but to outsiders, this is a place famous for Rockford peaches. Unfortunately, Rockford ranks top among the most violent cities in the U.S. This was where Katrina lived with her husband, Todd, and the two had met when Katrina was in her 20s while Todd worked as a DJ. And despite Todd being 15 years older, it didn't stop them from falling in love. Katrina told her friends that Todd fit in with their family. Even though Todd had 3 daughters from his previous marriage, it didn't matter to her. They got engaged and then got married. Katrina and Todd shared hobbies together at home and even ran a family business. The two spent every waking minute with one another. They'd been married for about 7 years at the time of Katrina's disappearance. In fact, they celebrated their wedding anniversary with a vacation just a short while before she vanished. As far as everyone could tell, these two were deeply in love. But unknown to her family, it was all a show. Katrina was tired of her marriage and wanted to leave Todd. She'd moved out of their home and stayed with a friend in Roscoe for a while, and she had even met with the divorce attorney. Turns out, Katrina had secretly fallen for another man named Guy Gabriel and told him how unhappy she was in her marriage. She hoped to finalize her divorce with Todd and start a new life with Guy. Despite Guy being arrested for domestic battery, Katrina saw him as a genuine, honest man. He was everything Todd wasn't. But before settling in with Guy Gabriel and officially leaving Todd, Katrina wanted to get a new job. The night before her big job interview, October 22nd, 2012, she visited Todd's place to do her laundry, as well as finally break the news that she decided to file for divorce. We don't really know how this conversation went over with Todd, but it seems as though he took the news fairly well, all things considered. Katrina finally left the house at around 9 p.m. that evening, but after that, she was never seen again. Her kids texted her multiple times, as did her husband and boyfriend, but all of their messages and calls remained unread and unanswered. No sooner than Katrina left the home that evening, she was gone. Considering Katrina never checked in with Todd to explain how the job interview went, and considering she never answered any of his calls, Todd was getting worried and called Katrina's sister, Miranda, to tell her he believed Katrina may be missing. Miranda was hopeful that her sister would be found later on that day, but this never happened. Todd later phoned Paige, his oldest daughter from his first marriage, and he told her he hadn't seen her stepmom for quite some time and couldn't get a hold of her. Paige was confused. Like Miranda, she knew Katrina would not just leave without a note or something. It was totally unlike her. After reaching out to all of their friends and loved ones and learning that no one had seen or spoken to Katrina in nearly 24 hours, that evening, Todd contacted local authorities to tell them about the disappearance of his wife. Earlier that day, Katrina's boss called Todd, wondering why she didn't show up for work. Every time before this, when she knew she wouldn't be at work, she would at least call and give some sort of notice, but not this time. Guy was confused too. He hadn't seen her that day, but knew she was at Todd's house the previous night. Todd told the police that his wife was scheduled for the interview that day but never appeared, and he confirmed that she'd been with him that night before, and they chatted briefly, but then she just vanished. Hours after Todd Smith reported the incident, Katrina's photo was plastered all around Rockford. The news spread like wildfire, with everyone doing their best to try to track her down. What's really interesting is that weeks before her disappearance, Katrina Smith reported that someone was stalking her. Turns out, a teenager had developed an unhealthy obsession with her. He followed her everywhere, desperately seeking her attention. Of course, the 30-year-old had nothing to offer him, repeatedly turning him down, and her boss also recalled that something bizarre had happened in the parking lot. A guy had thrown flyers out of his car window, containing some bizarre accusations about Katrina. The contents of these flyers have never been confirmed, but police began to wonder if this man may have been involved in her disappearance somehow. Family, friends, and volunteers knocked on every door. They went to nearly every home in the area looking for evidence. They asked both children and adults questions about any suspicious movements in the area. Hundreds of people gathered for a candlelit vigil to pray for Katrina's return, but it ultimately felt like feeding a lion with breadcrumbs. Their efforts just weren't working. Meanwhile, Todd conducted numerous media interviews to appeal to the public to help his wife return home safely. He originally didn't want to go on TV because he feared people would judge him, but somebody convinced him that it might help, so he gave it a shot. It was clear to everyone who saw his pleas for help that this man was seriously struggling. His whole world was flipped upside down. When detectives really began to dig into the case, the first person they spoke to was Todd Smith. As investigators questioned Todd, the search party was out searching for evidence. Around 24 hours after Katrina's missing person report was filed, detectives stumbled across her blue Chevy Cruze, abandoned on the side of the road in a residential neighborhood. A day later, her purse was found about 150 yards away from the car. The following day, her cell phone was found in a bush beside the road. While her family tried to make sense of these findings, a search group found blood-soaked paper towels in a field just south of where her car was parked. This was not the news anyone had been hoping for. A couple of weeks passed by, and the case took a shocking twist when an off-duty firefighter who was fishing in the Rock River near Byron noticed something floating down the river like a log. Because it was dark, he couldn't see what it was, so he took out his flashlight and shone it on the strange object. Even though he couldn't determine what it was, a gut feeling told him something was wrong. As the light hit the water, he saw clothing on what appeared to be a torso. His heart raced as he realized it was a body. He immediately contacted the Winnebago County detectives, who arrived in just minutes. As they pulled the body from the river, it became very clear it had been floating here for quite some time. Although the victim was clothed, her dress was faded and unidentifiable. She was in such bad shape at the time that no one even knew who this person was. But after a forensic analysis was carried out, it was unfortunately determined that this was Katrina Smith. She'd passed away from blunt force trauma to the head or possibly drowning. It was never confirmed which of these truly claimed her life. She suffered numerous bruises on her arms, body, and legs, and it was clear she had been through a lot before she lost her life. The missing person case now turned into a heartbreaking homicide investigation. Detectives had a long list of suspects, including some family members, but first they had to start with the last person she was seen with, Todd Smith, her husband. Katrina's phone became a crucial piece of evidence in her investigation. When the police retrieved it, they uncovered some shocking evidence. They found an unusually large number of text messages from Guy Gabriel on the night that she disappeared. This sudden spike in communication suddenly raised their suspicions, but Guy was at work that evening, so he had an airtight alibi. As far as police could tell, there was no chance that Guy was involved. As the police looked further into Katrina's life, though, they discovered she was being followed, and not by the obsessive teen that I mentioned a moment ago, but by someone else. She had a second stalker. Nobody knew who it was, but the evidence suggested it may have been Todd. Police began to look very closely at him. Unknown to many, Todd had an interesting criminal history. In 1985, when he was 17, he confessed to disconnecting a gas line in the home that he shared with his mother, stepfather, and 3 half-siblings. He stood outside as the home exploded into flames with his family still inside. Luckily, they all escaped the blast without major injuries. But when the police investigated the case, Todd openly confessed to arson. He told investigators that he had a fight with his mom and wanted to get back at her. He figured that the only way to do that was to scare her. He not only scared her, but he destroyed the home that they'd been living in for years. Todd was sentenced to 30 months probation and 160 hours of community service. He pleaded guilty to arson and waived his right to a trial. Todd later married his first wife, Teresa, and they had 3 daughters together. At the time, he struggled to provide for his family, and Teresa was getting overwhelmed. She worked full-time, and the burden of supporting the young family fell solely on her. After their 3rd daughter was born, the couple was forced to sell their home to pay off debts. This was the last straw. Working 2 jobs and caring for 3 daughters and a husband was just too much to handle. Eventually, she filed for divorce, and they shared custody of their 3 daughters. But when Teresa thought that she was finally free of this bad situation, something terrible happened. Something she never spoke to anyone about until Katrina's passing. One evening, just as she pulled into the driveway of her mother's home, someone snuck up behind her as she was getting out of her car, punching her in the face without any warning. The attacker was wearing a werewolf Halloween mask. She quickly fell to the ground, enduring the punches and kicks of this masked man who just refused to let up. She thought about what would happen if her mother came out of the house to find her lying lifeless in the front yard, and this thought gave her a rush of adrenaline that was enough to jump off the ground, push her attacker backward, and then run for her life. A neighbor who heard her screaming phoned 911 and filed a police report that very night. When police spoke with Teresa later on and asked her who the suspect could be, she said, "My husband, Todd." Police took fingernail scrapings from Teresa and compared them to fibers on Todd's jacket, but the results were inconclusive. They wanted to test for DNA, but Todd refused. Because the police couldn't get a search warrant to obtain his DNA sample, they closed the case and that was pretty much the end of it. But after the divorce from his first wife, Todd would meet Katrina, and they eventually got married and moved to Rockford, Illinois. Todd gave investigators plenty of reasons to suspect him for claiming Katrina's life. First, he grew agitated when he was separated from his family and friends during questioning. He didn't like that he was considered a suspect. Todd was so angry that he called Detective Vince Lindbergh to complain about the information the police gave Katrina's family. He questioned why the police told her family about the blood that was found in her vehicle's trunk. But the thing is, police hadn't found blood in Katrina's trunk. In fact, they'd only just received her car to begin processing it for evidence, but nothing had actually been processed yet. So how did Todd know that there would be blood found in the trunk? If that's not bad enough, well, things only got worse from here. For instance, while interrogating him, Todd turned red-faced and buried his head in his hands while making noises that sounded like crying. But when officers looked closely, they saw no tears. When officers confronted him with evidence from his wife's affair, he pretended to be shocked. But it was clear that Todd knew all along about his wife's infidelity and the identity of her lover. And that's because he'd previously found a card in Katrina's car that had come from Guy, in which he described her as the love of his life. Todd denied ever throwing vulgar flyers about his wife into the parking lot of her place of work. But a surveillance camera in the parking lot showed a vehicle that had no license plate, and police believed it had been borrowed from a local car dealership. The cops scoured every car lot in town to find a match, and eventually they found the dealership. The owner confirmed that Todd visited the store several weeks back looking for a car. The black Volkswagen in the corner of the lot caught his attention, and he test drove it around town. He further added that anybody who test drives a vehicle must provide a photocopy of their driver's license. He helped investigators get the license copies, and they found Todd Smith's photocopied license at the bottom of the stack. This confirmed that Todd took a car for a test drive on October 9th, 2012, the same day the parking lot incident took place. On October 30th, police got a warrant to search Todd's house. And without alerting anyone, they stormed in and retrieved his laptop and a baseball bat from the garage. This bat appeared to be covered in blood. Detectives immediately sent the bat to the crime lab for analysis, and about 3 weeks later, they found traces of Katrina's DNA on the bat. Todd was immediately arrested. On the night of October 22nd, 2012, Katrina left her Roscoe condominium and headed to her husband's house to do her laundry. But laundry wasn't the only reason she went there. She planned to tell Todd that she wanted a divorce, as mentioned a moment ago. They'd been living separate lives for quite some time, but they did their best to keep this on the down low until a decision had been made. Well, Katrina made that decision and the divorce was filed for. When she broke the news to Todd, Todd tried to talk her out of the divorce, but she insisted she wanted to leave him. He even suggested that they adopt children together, insisting they could fix this, but she was adamant about moving on. She couldn't continue pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. As the conversation was winding down, Katrina grabbed her things and planned on leaving, but as she neared the door, Todd grabbed a bat and unleashed on her. After she'd fallen unconscious, Todd then placed her in her car, drove her to the Ventura Boulevard area, and tossed her into the river. He then returned to the house on foot after abandoning her car and cleaning up the scene. When police got a hold of his laptop, they saw that he had a file on Katrina. This file included all of the location data for the past several weeks. Turns out, Todd had placed a tracker on her car and was following her every move. At this point, everything was beginning to make sense. His computer showed that Katrina was last seen on the Latham Street Bridge, exactly where her body was found. It took many months before prosecutors put the case together and charged Todd Smith with the crime. Just before her disappearance, Katrina visited a U.S. cellular store in Belvedere 3 times in October. A sales rep from the store appeared at the trial and told the court that Katrina was scared about her husband accessing her text messages. She didn't want him to know who she'd spoken to and what they discussed. She showed up at the store that day to see about getting a new phone number and a private account that Todd couldn't access. By now, Katrina was convinced that her husband was using her phone to track her movements. But little did she know that the tracker was actually placed on her car. The sales rep advised Katrina to get a restraining order against her husband, especially after she noticed Katrina's hands were shaking and she looked as though she might cry. Katrina never did get that restraining order. Katrina's stepfather, Bruce Edlund, also took the stand. He told the jury that Todd had told him about their failing marriage. He didn't believe him at first, but when Katrina stopped joining him for church on Sundays, he was convinced something was wrong. A week before her passing, Katrina texted Bruce, asking him how to obtain an Illinois firearm permit. She also inquired if she could practice at a gun range without such a permit. Edlund didn't take much meaning out of these questions, and he shrugged off the feeling that something might be wrong. Prosecutors invited Guy Gabriel to take the stand. He opened up to the public about his relationship with Katrina. It turned out that their relationship started in the office where they worked together. She worked in HR, while he was a supervisor in another department. They spent the weekend before her passing together at her condominium in Roscoe. A few days later, in her final messages with Guy, she told him she planned to do laundry at Todd's house and watch Monday Night Football afterward. She also opened up about her plans to divorce Todd. He encouraged her to come clean and communicate with him, laying it all out so they were on the same page. But her tone showed that she was scared of how Todd would react. In fact, she'd been deliberately keeping that information from him for fear of what he may do to her. Despite all of this evidence and all the witness statements, Todd maintained his innocence. But the judge disagreed with Todd. He called Katrina Smith's loss evil and senseless. He said, quote, "The fact is, Todd Smith, you killed her. You beat her on the head with a blunt instrument and put her in the river. Your actions after the crime I find unfathomable. You threw her in the river. Like a plastic bag going down the river to Oregon." Needless to say, Todd was found guilty and was sentenced to over 50 years behind bars. In the aftermath of the trial, Katrina's family was immensely grateful for the verdict. Her mother, Vicky, let go of a sigh of relief as she finally got justice for her beloved daughter. The trial had been emotionally exhausting for her family, but thankfully Todd was exposed as the monster he truly is. Katrina was laid to rest at Arlington Memorial Park Cemetery on Mount Vernon Highway. In her memory, her family opened a foundation named Sissy's Footprints Foundation. This foundation is dedicated to helping people who've lost loved ones, especially under tragic circumstances, helping them learn to cope and giving them a shoulder to lean on when they need it most. The foundation's website is sissysfootprintsfoundation.com and has a forum where people can share their stories of loss and connect with others for support. In the end, Katrina's family did their best to make the most of an awful, terrible situation. The senseless violence against Katrina is just heartbreaking, that's putting it lightly. To think that one man can feel so entitled, yet be so vile, such a nasty person, I just don't get it. In the end, Katrina had to pay the price for this man's senseless actions, and it just doesn't add up. I just hope that as time passed by, Katrina's family may find some level of comfort in knowing that this man can never hurt anyone ever again. Jason Corbett was known for being a family man through and through. He loved his kids more than anything and was willing to do whatever it took to keep them safe and happy. But according to detectives and even some of the crime scene investigators, there was much more to Jason's story than meets the eye. Police have conflicting opinions about this case. Some officers believe that Jason truly was the family man he portrayed himself to be, but others believe he had a dark side that only showed up behind closed doors. Whatever the case, in August of 2015, Jason lost his life in one of the most vicious crimes I've ever covered here on True Crime Stories. But what makes this case so incredibly disturbing isn't just that someone took Jason's life, it's who took it and why. Jason Corbett was born and raised in Limerick, Ireland. His two children, 10-year-old Jack and 8-year-old Sarah, were the light of his world, and he did all he could to make sure that they had the best life possible. But unfortunately, Jason couldn't protect his kids from one of the most tragic days of their lives. See, when their kids were very young, their mother, Margaret, passed away unexpectedly from a severe asthma attack. Her passing came as a complete shock to the family and was particularly devastating for Jason, as you can probably imagine. While Margaret had issues with asthma in the past, no one expected her to lose her life in such a sudden, painful, and terrifying series of events. It was just so out of left field. This tragedy left Jason in a really difficult spot. Considering Jason was a plant manager for an international packaging company, his job required him to spend large amounts of time away from his children. Before, Margaret would help pick up the slack and ensure the kids had a pretty normal home life. But now that she was gone, well, it was incredibly difficult for the young family. It didn't take Jason long at all to admit that he needed help, and quickly. This led him to find the help of a woman named Molly Martins, who offered to help look after the children for Jason while he was at work. But the thing about Molly is that she lived in the United States, halfway across the world from Jason in Ireland. She agreed to move in with the family, crossing the ocean over to Ireland, and in exchange, Jason would help her get citizenship there. Truth be told, Molly didn't seem to have any nefarious intentions. She wasn't moving here with the hopes of becoming Jason's wife, nor did she plan on essentially becoming a replacement for the children's mother. But by the end of it all, that is exactly what happened. Now, Molly insists that she didn't have an ulterior motive when she moved in with Jason, but considering Jason is no longer around to tell his side of the story, we'll never really know what his intentions were. But considering this guy was so dedicated to making sure his children were safe and cared for, I find it hard to believe if he had any hidden intentions either. But either way, the relationship between Jason and Molly began innocently enough at first. But before long, the two had fallen for each other. But rather than remain in Ireland, the family now decided that their best chance at getting a fresh start would be to move to the United States. And that's exactly what they did, finding a place to call home in Davidson County, North Carolina. That same year, Jason and Molly officially tied the knot and got married. Everything went amazingly well for the family for the first several years. Jason went to work at the packaging plant while Molly helped out around the house and with the children, and eventually even took on a role of a children's swimming coach. But by the end of August of 2015, things had changed. In the early hours of the morning, a 911 call rang through to emergency operators. On the other end of the line was Molly's father, Tom.
My daughter's husband, my son-in-law, got in a fight with my daughter. I intervened, and I think he's in bad shape. We need help.
Okay, what do you mean he's in bad shape? He's hurt?
He's bleeding all over, and I may have killed him.
Molly's father, Tom, a former FBI agent, had been spending some time with the family, visiting with his daughter, her new husband, and his newfound grandchildren. When the entire family was asleep, but all of a sudden, around 3 a.m. in the morning, Molly says that Sarah, their youngest daughter, woke up from a bad dream and a panic, believing that the fairies that were printed on her bed sheets were actually lizards and bugs. Molly ran in to calm the girl down with Jason close behind. But Molly suggests that rather than being calm and understanding of the girl's bad dream, Jason flew into a fit of rage. He began shouting at Molly as if this were somehow her fault. The two quickly got into a heated argument, and that's when Jason reportedly grabbed Molly by the throat. And that's when Tom walked in and, as he put it, intervened. By the time Tom was finished with Jason, he was left lying on the floor, bleeding profusely. Tom immediately called 911 for help. The 911 operator told Tom how to administer CPR, and he and Molly took turns doing this until paramedics arrived, less than 10 minutes later. But by the time they got to Jason's side, there was nothing they could do. He was gone. To say they found Jason in a bad state, well, that doesn't even begin to describe it. The amount of anger that Tom unleashed on Jason was unreal. This man had trauma consistent with being struck by a car or falling off a cliff, not being restrained by his father-in-law. When detectives showed up a short while later, they admitted that evidence was everywhere. They collected forensic samples from the floor, the walls, the bed, everywhere. This attack had clearly dragged on for quite some time, and Tom just wasn't letting up. As investigators began combing through all the clues and evidence left around the scene of the crime, they found a 28-inch baseball bat that had been leaning against a dresser in the couple's bedroom. It's believed that this was the primary item that was used to, in Tom's words, intervene. But as they kept looking, they noticed a small brick paver had also been dropped in the bedroom. This paver was found to have been covered in blood, which wasn't painting a good picture of what had unfolded here. When Molly and Tom were asked to come by the police station to issue a statement, Molly told detectives the story of Sarah waking up and being frightened by the characters printed on her bedsheets. Tom explained how he'd heard a commotion and went inside the bedroom to find Jason holding Molly by her neck, and that's when he jumped in. At this point, police were uncertain of how to proceed. If the attack had taken place exactly as these two claimed, well, then Jason likely lost his life in a bit of self-defense. Case closed. But considering the detectives found two separate weapons at the crime scene, both of which had clearly been used against Jason, this was beginning to look like something much more nefarious. Police were now looking more closely at the crime scene. When officers arrived at the home that morning, there was one particular scenario that just didn't make sense to them. If Tom stated that he'd woken up after hearing a commotion, and Molly stated that Sarah had woken up shouting out of fear, and their fight began immediately afterward, then wouldn't the children have heard the struggle? Yet, when investigators arrived, both of the children were fast asleep in their bedrooms as if nothing happened. This led police to a frightening theory. Jason didn't attack Molly that evening. In fact, he couldn't have. That's because when the crime unfolded, Jason was fast asleep. As police continued to dig deeper and deeper into the situation, they'd convinced themselves that Molly and Tom had to be lying. The evidence just wasn't adding up to the story these two had told to investigators. This is when they decided to press charges against both Molly and Tom for second-degree homicide, as well as voluntary manslaughter. It would now be up to the jury to decide who did what and how exactly this crime had played out. The defense team, the team working for Molly and Tom, painted Jason as being an angry, bitter man who would often lash out at Molly. But the prosecution, the team working on Jason's behalf, insisted that there was no indication and no evidence that Jason was an angry or violent person. He'd never exhibited this behavior before, and no one had anything bad to say about him. On the evening of the crime, Jason even offered to help bring Molly's parents' luggage inside for them, as they'd obviously planned on spending the night with them. He all around seemed like a great, family-oriented man. The family's neighbor admitted that he'd never really noticed any aggression between Tom and Molly. He even stated that Jason was known for his very calm demeanor. The two had actually been hanging out all afternoon on that day, and he said that nothing seemed out of the ordinary about Jason. They'd been chatting from about 3:30 p.m. to about 8:30 p.m. that afternoon, and their get-together only stopped when Molly's parents pulled up in the driveway, at which point Jason left to greet them. The neighbor added that when Jason saw them pulling up, his demeanor didn't change one bit. It was still completely calm, and he may have even been happy to see them. This is when detectives began to dig up some suspicious evidence against Molly and Tom. It would come to light that Jason had been making plans to move back to Ireland, but Molly didn't want to go. Jason felt that it would be best for his kids and for the family as a whole, but Molly was strictly against this idea. She feared that if she didn't agree, Jason may even take the children and move countries without her. And this wasn't just some theory that police concocted, this was somewhat of a proven fact. Evidence was later shown to the court that proved that Tom had struck Jason with a bat on the evening of the crime, and Molly openly admitted to striking Jason with the brick paver that was found in the bedroom. According to Tom and Molly, as soon as Jason fell to the ground, their attack stopped and they immediately called 911. But one of the paramedics noticed something odd. There was dried blood on Jason's body. The paramedics had arrived in less than 10 minutes, so how could this have already dried? One of the paramedics spoke at the trial and admitted that the scene of the crime was beyond gruesome. The trauma that was noted to Jason's head was just downright repulsive. There was nothing left of him. This was leading the court to a fairly universal opinion. This crime was no accident. Molly's parents hadn't just happened to stop by for the night, and that's because they've been planning on taking Jason's life all along. When Chief Medical Examiner Craig Nelson testified in the court proceedings, he announced that the cause of Jason's passing was rather obviously blunt force trauma. He noted a total of 12 injuries to Jason's skull, with several of these injuries showing repeated blows. He concluded that Jason had been struck in the head over a dozen times, but he believed this number could have been much, much higher. There just wasn't any way to say for certain, as there was nothing left of the guy. But this is where things get very interesting. When a toxicology report was done on Jason's body, it was found that he had a small amount of alcohol in his system, likely from when he was hanging out with his neighbor. But he also had trazodone in his system. Interestingly, trazodone is considered to be an antidepressant, but Jason wasn't considered to be depressed, nor had any doctor ever prescribed him this medication. This is when the family's doctor was asked to take the stand. When questioned about this medication, she admitted that Molly had recently come in and claimed that she was having trouble sleeping. Trazodone, as it turns out, isn't actually very effective at treating depression, but it works great for helping you fall asleep. Thus, Molly was given a prescription for the medication, not Jason. When Molly was initially taken in for questioning after calling 911 that night, detectives took several photos of her to document any injuries that she may have incurred at the hands of Jason. But there were none. She was completely clean aside from a small amount of Jason's blood that was on her. During her interrogation, she was seen repeatedly pulling and grasping at her own neck, to which an officer requested that she stop. But all throughout the interview, she just kept grabbing at her neck, as if she was trying to hurt herself. Maybe so that she'd have bruises show up in the photos later on, but this obviously didn't work if it truly was her plan. When Tom was questioned, there were no injuries or bruises found on him either. Both of these two were completely free and clear. Now, to be fair, when paramedics arrived at the scene, they did note that Molly had a bit of redness on her neck, but they also noticed that she kept grabbing at her own neck the entire time they were there as well. So it's unclear whether this redness would have come from an injury or if it was just the fact that she kept grabbing it herself. It would then come to light that Molly had also been struggling with some mental health issues, but it's not clear if these were previous issues or current issues she was dealing with. But whatever the case, the prosecution suggested that her mental health issues caused her to repeatedly ask Jason to allow her to officially adopt his children. Though, let's be real, the two had been married 4 or 5 years. It's not particularly unusual for a new spouse to want to adopt her stepchildren. But either way, Jason wasn't okay with this, and he repeatedly denied her request, which caused an understandable amount of anger in Molly. Molly was deeply in love with these children, and according to one report, one of her biggest fears was that Jason would one day take the children away from her. But it's never been explained why she believed this. After all, the two were married, their lives were tightly intertwined, and they were reportedly quite happy with one another. So unless she had underlying abandonment issues, I just can't understand why she would be so terrified of losing these kids. But then came the most shocking revelation of all: the insurance policy. As it turns out, Jason had quite a bit of money. In fact, when they purchased their super nice home in North Carolina, he paid for the entire thing in cash, just wired the money right over to the United States without even being there in person. He also wired money over to pay for furniture. We're talking hundreds upon thousands of dollars. He even wired a $49,000 payment to Molly's father around this same time. And the note attached to this payment simply read, "For the marriage." This payment has never been explained, but considering Molly was proven to have been an au pair, well, many people are a bit suspicious about this payment. When it was revealed that Jason's life insurance policy totaled around $600,000, there was a very clear image appearing here, and it didn't paint Molly or her father in a very good light. When you combine this with the fact that Molly refused to testify at trial, well, I don't know about you, but that's just downright suspicious. With all of this evidence stacked against her, the only reason I can come up with that would cause her to refuse to testify would simply be that she didn't want to be caught in a lie. After all, her father was a former FBI agent, so he would likely be pretty good at keeping a story straight. But when you throw Molly into the mix, well, that makes 2 potential points of failure rather than 1. So it's best for their sake that she remains silent. But again, this is just a theory. Molly claims that Jason had been abusive toward her all throughout their marriage, but not a single shred of evidence was found to prove this. She never filed any police reports against him, and no one in the local community had anything bad to say about him. Molly insisted that Jason's children be asked to give a statement at the trial, insisting their version of events would perfectly line up with what she and her father had been claiming unfolded that night. But the children had already been taken back home to Ireland, presumably to live with Tom's parents. Because of this, their statements were never heard by the jury. But here's where things, once again, get very interesting. The defense team was able to dig up 2 interviews that were conducted with Jason's children. One interview was taken on the day that he lost his life, and another was taken after his funeral. In these reports, what the children had to say about their father was not nice. These interviews conducted with Jason's children really call this whole case into question, and really make you wonder if Molly and Tom may actually have been telling the truth. A social worker who was employed by the Union County Department of Social Services conducted the interviews with each of the kids. Both of the children referred to Jason getting mad at Molly, and they claimed that this would happen on a regular basis. They also claimed to have once witnessed Jason grab Molly by the hair and, quote, smack her in the face. In another interview, the children reported that Jason would get angry over simple things such as bills or leaving the lights on. The kids each referred to multiple instances where Jason would hurt Molly. In one interview, Sarah explained that she would occasionally have nightmares, and Molly would come in to comfort her in the middle of the night. She continued by saying that her father would sometimes get incredibly angry if she accidentally woke him up. Now, one thing that a lot of us have probably been asking is, what about the brick paver that Molly used to attack Jason? I don't know about you, but it's always seemed suspicious to me. Who keeps a brick in their bedroom? Well, the children explained this too. They claimed that they planned on painting the brick with Molly as a decoration, but that day it had been raining, so they weren't able to get the brick painted. In the end, none of these statements from the children were allowed to be used at the trial, as the children had already left the country. This meant that when all was said and done, both Molly and Tom were found guilty, and they were each sentenced to 25 years behind bars. But all hope was not lost. Both Tom and Molly appealed their sentences. Molly's first attempt failed, but after a while they were both allowed to bring their appeals before the North Carolina Supreme Court. Here, the court ruled that the two were allowed to be released on a bail of $200,000 each, pending a retrial. They were both ordered to give up their passports, and they were not allowed to make any contact with either Jack or Sarah. But believe it or not, the twists in this story aren't over. After Molly and Tom were released, the children were finally able to be contacted for a follow-up interview. During this interview, they both admitted that they were, quote, coached to lie in their statements, admitting that none of the domestic abuse ever happened. They furthered this by saying that Molly was the one who convinced them to lie to the police, as well as to the social worker. So with all that said, where does this leave us? Well, it was announced in June of 2024 that a retrial had been completed. Both Molly and Tom took a plea deal in which they both pleaded guilty to charges of manslaughter. They each could have been held in prison for up to an additional 17 years, but the judge decided to only sentence them to 51 months each, while also giving them credit for the time they'd already served. When you consider that they each already spent about 4 years in prison, that meant that their time was essentially already completed. I'll save you the math and just say that 4 years is equivalent to about 48 months. In the end, they each served about an additional 7 months in prison, and they were now allowed to walk free. So at the end of the day, I'm not sure what to say about this case. Were Tom and Molly truly defending themselves that evening? I don't know. Were the kids lying when they mentioned the abuse Molly had endured, or were they actually lying about lying? No one really knows. All we know for sure is that Jason lost his life that day, and innocent or not, that simply didn't deserve to happen. Even if we assume that Jason was the monster Molly made him out to be, who is she to decide whether he lives or dies? Everyone deserves a chance at redemption, and if Jason was as violent and angry as Molly claims, calling the police would have been the best option. Though I do admit, in abusive relationships, sometimes this only makes things worse when there truly is no way to escape. On the other hand, if Molly and Tom made the whole thing up, then this innocent man lost his life for no reason at all. Literally, no reason at all. Because Molly isn't even eligible for the life insurance payout now that she pleaded guilty as part of the plea deal. This case is just tragic from all angles, and I just hate it for Jason's kids more than anything, because Regardless of whether he was an angry man or one of the greatest fathers to ever live, every child deserves to spend a childhood with their parents. But for these two incredibly unfortunate souls, both of their parents have now been taken away. Obsession can be a very dangerous thing, especially when that obsession is left to grow and fester, and certainly when it centers around a specific person who doesn't share the same feelings. When these feelings are coupled with rejection, well, it's a recipe for disaster in many cases, and it's the innocent party who suffers when one of these obsessions spirals out of control. When we hear that someone has an obsession with another person, we usually think of it as creepy or disturbing. But in the case of 22-year-old Haley Anderson, it all started out very innocently, but ended in disaster. In 2018, Haley Anderson was a student at Binghamton University in New York. She shared an apartment with a few of her fellow students, Josie Arden and Michaela Topali, and everyone in the group was in their final year of college. Haley was studying nursing, and true to her nature, was not only looking forward to finishing college, but had already found a job in Long Island, where she would be part of the emergency department at Northwell Health. Haley's mother described her as being a millennial hippie, who was known to have a great love for music and a friendly and compassionate nature. This, along with her desire to help others, made her chosen career path obvious, and her future looked as bright as she had imagined it. During her studies in the nursing program, she met a fellow student named Orlando Tercero, who was born in Miami and grew up in Nicaragua. And despite their clear differences in upbringing, the pair instantly hit it off. They started dating but didn't take the relationship too seriously at first, and Haley's friends would later state that they broke up and got back together several times, but always remained friends. When Haley wasn't in the midst of studying for an exam or attending classes, she enjoyed hanging out with her roommates, and on the 8th of March of that year, that was exactly what she, Josie, and Michaela were doing. The group had decided to stay up late that night, and they shared a few drinks while they were playing board games in their apartment. At around 4 a.m., they decided to go to bed, and they each headed off to their separate rooms. None of them had any idea that by the following day, their lives would be irrevocably changed forever. Josie made it to her room that night and fell fast asleep fairly quickly. She slept throughout the night without a care in the world, waking up the following morning and deciding to reach out to her roommates after having her morning coffee. She headed over to Haley's room, but immediately noticed that Haley wasn't in her bed, but this wasn't terribly unusual. In fact, most college students would attest to this. Josie decided to send Haley a text to see if she was still willing to attend a poetry reading that night, since Josie would be reading some of her work and she really wanted her friends to be there. But she got no reply. Calls to Haley's cell phone also went unanswered, and as the day went by, her friends started becoming more and more concerned, since Haley was always quick to respond. This was not like her at all. She was also usually very active on her social media accounts, but none of them had seen any activity since the previous day, and this was not a good sign. At the very least, Haley's friends felt that she would have at least notified her roommates about where she was, whether or not she was okay, and whether she'd be meeting them for the poetry reading later on. But they hadn't heard one single word. Her silence was completely out of character, and they started to think that something might be very wrong. Luckily, her roommates remembered that she was using an iPhone, and they could track it via the Find My Friends app. Thankfully, their efforts were successful, and they realized that her phone was on Oak Street, the same street that Orlando, her boyfriend, lived on. This was a perfectly reasonable explanation for why she'd suddenly just up and vanished. She'd spent the night out with her boyfriend and likely just lost track of time. But unbeknownst to Josie and Michaela, the situation was much worse. As it would turn out, the police had already been to Orlando's house earlier that day. His sister had contacted him to report that he'd sent her a very worrying text message earlier that morning, in which he stated that he'd done something bad that would disgrace their family. But he didn't elaborate on what was going on. Since then, he'd fallen completely silent, and she'd been unable to get a hold of him. When Orlando hadn't responded to any of his sister's calls or texts, she asked if the police could stop by his house to make sure that he was okay, as he'd also been acting very strangely. Investigators were happy to oblige and traveled to his house, but when they arrived, they got no answer at the door. The house seemed empty, and since nothing seemed to be out of place and there didn't seem to be any cause for alarm, they left without making contact with him, since they didn't have the immediate cause to enter the building. After all, it was very likely that Orlando just wanted to be left alone, and it's not their place to bother him. When Michaela and Josie arrived at the house later on, nothing had changed. The building seemed quiet as ever, almost as if nobody was home. Interestingly, Orlando's car was not parked in the driveway, but they knew that Haley's phone was inside the house, and so they decided to investigate further. They walked around outside the house and managed to find an open window. Michaela climbed through first, quickly followed by Josie, and they started searching through the house while making their way to the bedroom, assuming that's where Haley's phone would most likely be. As they combed through the house, they quickly confirmed that Orlando was not inside as expected. But it was then that their lives were changed forever. As soon as they entered the bedroom, they saw Haley lying on the bed, partially covered by the sheets. They instantly knew something was very wrong, since she was pale and didn't respond to any of their shouts. The girls didn't immediately understand what was going on, likely because they were in shock. Worried that Haley may have been badly injured or worse, they called 911 and the police were sent back to the house to investigate. When officers arrived, the girls' worst fears were confirmed. Haley had lost her life. It didn't take investigators more than a few minutes to determine that Haley had lost her life after her breathing had been restricted. A local pathologist would later add that someone had done this with their bare hands. The pathologist also noticed a few other strange marks on Haley's neck, but he believed these were caused by the necklace that she'd been wearing. Naturally, the first question on everyone's mind was, where's Orlando? No one had been able to contact him, and he clearly hadn't been home all day. Investigators questioned Haley's roommates and quickly learned of Haley and Orlando's on-again, off-again relationship, which they immediately suspected may have played a part in the crime. Josie and Michaela explained that the couple had never gotten too serious, and that Haley had finally decided to end their relationship for good as her graduation grew closer. She was more than willing to be patient with Orlando while the two were in school, but now that her life was moving on, her wants and needs changed, and Orlando just didn't fit the image of what she pictured her future would be like. But it would then come to light that there was another man in the picture, Haley's ex-boyfriend, Kevin Ocampo. Haley and Kevin had gotten back together in September of 2017 while she and Orlando were taking a break. Orlando found out about this while the three of them were attending a house party, and he didn't react well at all, as he was seen shouting at her at one point during the night. It seems that when they were on a break, Orlando assumed that that just meant they'd be spending time apart, alone. But Haley believed that meant they could see other people. During that exchange, Orlando admitted that he was in love with Haley, and he didn't approve of her dating anyone else. But Haley stood her ground and stated that she just wanted to be friends since she didn't share the same feelings that he did. When the party was over, Haley stayed over at Kevin's place, and this is when the first signs of trouble reared their head. When the couple woke up the next morning, Kevin walked outside and found that Haley's car tires had been slashed. Everyone was certain that Orlando was responsible, since he was clearly very jealous of their relationship. She contacted the police, who then interviewed Orlando, but he maintained his innocence. Haley also knew that since the damage done to her tires totaled more than $600, Orlando would be facing felony charges if he was found to have been responsible. Since she didn't want to ruin his future, she told him that she would hold off from pressing charges if he just agreed to pay for new tires, but there's no word on whether or not he ever agreed to this. As time passed by, it seems as though Kevin and Orlando eventually mended fences and came to terms with one another. In fact, Kevin would eventually ask Orlando to join his fraternity, since they were the only two Spanish-speaking students on campus. But Orlando would lose his place in the group when it came to light that he'd spent a night with Haley while she and Kevin were still dating. Following this, Orlando repeatedly would make Haley feel guilty about what had happened, stating that he wanted to end his own life. While Haley was certainly getting sick of this, she never turned her back on him and continued their relationship. But it was blatantly obvious that Orlando wanted more than she was willing to give. Before long, Orlando started acting obsessively, often driving past the apartment that she shared with Josie and Michaela, even showing up at their door unannounced. It was usually up to Josie to tell him that this was inappropriate behavior and that he needed to leave, but he just didn't get the message, no matter how plainly she laid it out for him. Bringing things back to the crime at hand, Just about everyone involved in the investigation was certain that Orlando was responsible for taking Haley's life. But there were still many unanswered questions. For example, why did he leave the house that morning? When did he leave the house that morning? Did Haley go to Orlando's house by herself, or did he pick her up? Luckily, his house was surrounded by surveillance cameras, and investigators managed to find footage showing Haley and Orlando arriving at the house together and walking inside. They noted that Haley seemed to be there willingly, and nothing suspicious came from the footage. The pair then stayed inside the house for a few hours, and eventually Orlando could be seen walking out of the building and clearing trash from the driveway. Following that, he went to a nearby pharmacy and bought a bottle of sleeping medication and melatonin. This was determined after a receipt from the pharmacy was found inside the house. He then went back to his house and remained inside for the next 7 hours, after which he could be seen exiting and walking into the house's basement. This was the first major clue that investigators found. They now decided to head down to the basement to see if any evidence could be found here that may allude to where Orlando had gone. But nothing could prepare them for what they were about to walk into. When the basement was searched, it became clear to detectives that Orlando attempted to end his own life while he was down there. They discovered a set of hooks that had been screwed into a doorway, along with a length of rope, though some sources state that it was in fact a tie, not a rope. Police also found blood on the floor, leading them to believe that Orlando had fallen and injured himself during the attempt. Lastly, investigators discovered a note written in Spanish, which translated to, "I'm really sorry about this. I've never felt I could be capable of doing this. Father, I'll see you soon." Since his father had passed away years earlier, investigators took the note as not only proof that he intended to end his own life, but also a confession to claiming Haley's. There's no telling what must have been going through his mind at this point, since Orlando knew that he would be the first person suspected of the crime. But since his attempt at ending his own life had failed, he must have been desperate to get away, as far away as he could. Security footage then showed him leaving the property for the last time while carrying a suitcase, and his subsequent movements placed him at JFK International Airport, where he boarded a flight, his head still bandaged from the injury. And he escaped to Nicaragua, where he was a dual citizen, hoping police couldn't find him there. But the main problem with this plan is that Nicaragua has an extradition treaty with the United States, meaning that even if he managed to successfully flee to the country, if United States investigators determined him to have been responsible for the crime, he would quickly be arrested and sent right back to the US. At least in theory. There have been instances where the Nicaraguan government has refused to extradite criminals back to the US, and the local district attorney believed that that may ring true in this case. District Attorney Stephen Cornwell stated that when he heard that Orlando had made it out of the country, he was certain he would never face justice for what he had done, since it would be up to the Nicaraguan authorities to decide whether he would be extradited back to the US or not. Since he had dual citizenship, the chances looked bleak. It would later come to light that Orlando's mother met him at the airport when his flight landed, and that they then drove for 3 hours north to her home. Here, he kept a low profile, since he must have known that he was being pursued by police back in New York. While all of this was unfolding, Haley's family was reeling from the news of her passing. And to make matters worse, they had no way of communicating with authorities in Nicaragua, leaving them uncertain as to what could be done to bring Orlando to justice. They didn't know if the police in that country knew that he was being sought in the US, not to mention whether they were even looking to capture him. But unbeknownst to them, news of the case had already made headlines there, and although it never was confirmed, it seems that he then tried to end his own life once again, but was unsuccessful. This is safely assumed because investigators learned that his mother drove him to the hospital 4 days after his arrival, where he received treatment for self-inflicted wounds, though it was never specified exactly what types of wounds he was treated for. Unfortunately for Orlando, this would be the decision that would finally be his undoing. After he arrived at the hospital, someone recognized him from the wanted images that had made their way across the country. Whoever the witness was, they contacted the authorities and reported him. Detectives found him at the hospital, where he was finally taken into custody. Back in the US, Orlando was charged with claiming Haley's life, and all investigators could do was wait and see whether he would be ordered to return so that he could be put on trial. For the next year, authorities from both countries debated whether he should remain in Nicaragua or be returned to the US, and eventually the decision was made for the trial to be held in his home country. And this was not the news that police or Haley's family had been hoping for. And if you ask me, it's just a blatant miscarriage of justice. The crime didn't even take place in Nicaragua. So all of the evidence and details of the investigation would have to be handed down secondhand. And we all know how that goes. This filled Haley's family with dread, since they also learned that the trial would be held without a jury, and that one single judge would have to decide what fate would be appropriate for Orlando's actions. To make matters worse, Orlando wasn't even charged with second-degree homicide, but instead faced a charge of femicide, which is considered to be a hate crime in Nicaragua. Orlando wouldn't even be asked to enter a plea, and this makes it very clear why Haley's family had their reservations about the process that would be followed. During the trial, the prosecution leaned heavily on the fact that Orlando had shown obsessive behavior towards Haley, and that those who knew her the most were well aware of this fact. Her friends reiterated that while Haley had entered the house willingly, showing that she trusted him, Orlando betrayed that trust by ending her life, possibly while she was asleep. They further claimed that Orlando's obsession had been festering for as much as 6 months when he was told by Haley that she didn't want a serious relationship and that she'd gotten back together with Kevin. But this news just didn't click with Orlando. He was determined to either get Haley back or take her out of the picture for good. The theory that the court was operating under was that Orlando had brought up the idea of reigniting their relationship once more on the morning that Haley lost her life. It's assumed she turned him down one final time, and that's when he decided to end her life. Haley's friends were allowed to testify via live teleconferencing, and they reiterated Orlando's obsessive behavior in the months leading up to the crime. They revealed that he would sometimes be found sitting on their porch without being invited, that he was responsible for slashing Haley's tires, and they would often call the apartment to ask for her, even when he'd been repeatedly asked to stop. In the courtroom, the judge also watched the surveillance footage from outside Orlando's house, showing him entering with Haley and then leaving on several occasions while she was still inside. Evidence of his attempt to end his own life was also heard. The pathologist who worked on Haley's case was also called to testify. He confirmed the cause of Haley's passing as manual strangulation, and the prosecution reiterated that Haley had her life taken from her by a man who couldn't accept the fact that she'd made a decision that he didn't agree with, and that it was his obsessive nature that drove him to commit such a despicable crime, which was unforgivable in their eyes. There was no doubt by this point that Orlando was the one who carried out the crime, and hence his defense team decided to build their case around the fact that he'd been drinking the night before he and Haley met up, a desperate attempt to clear his name. They claimed that he had no memory of the events that took place that night, and that due to his excessive drinking earlier that night, he'd gone, quote, temporarily insane when she rejected him, causing him to lose his temper and attack her out of jealousy. This was very obviously a last resort effort to at least have Orlando declared legally insane at the time of the crime, hoping to lessen his sentence or have the case thrown out entirely. In stark contrast to the prosecution, the defense only brought one witness to the trial, a psychiatrist who examined Orlando after he was arrested. He stated that when he questioned Orlando about what had happened, Orlando couldn't give any details of the crime, as he claimed that he'd been very intoxicated and couldn't remember what he had done. He claimed that he could only remember waking up the following morning and realizing that Haley was no longer alive. When asked what Orlando's state of mind would have been when carrying out the crime, the psychiatrist stated that he couldn't say, but added that there was nothing out of the ordinary about his state of mind when he interviewed him after the fact. His defense team also stated that Orlando wasn't known to be a violent individual, and that there was the possibility that he only carried out the crime after he was provoked, though they had no evidence to prove this theory. Once both sides had been heard, the judge left the courtroom for 90 minutes, after which she returned with a verdict: guilty. While delivering the verdict, the judge stated that Orlando was clearly incapable of accepting Haley's decision, and that she felt that Orlando wanted to punish Haley for rejecting him yet again. He was found guilty of the charge of femicide, and she found that the maximum sentence of 30 years behind bars was appropriate. During the sentencing, she stated that all women have the right to life, and that these types of crimes against them should be met with the harshest possible consequences. So Orlando was destined to be sent away for 30 years. The case was unprecedented, since Nicaragua and the US had never worked together in this manner before, with law enforcement agencies collaborating from across borders to bring justice to a woman whose incredibly promising life had been ended by a man who just couldn't take no for an answer. When all was said and done, Haley's family stated that they were satisfied with the outcome, since they were expecting the trial to end very differently, but they were satisfied that the judge had made the right decision. It's often the case in these kinds of trials that something akin to a show trial is put on, all for the sake of publicity, and criminals are allowed to walk free after the fact, but Orlando was now set to pay for his actions accordingly. But Orlando wouldn't accept this verdict either. This man genuinely could not accept anything that went against his own way of thinking. He decided to appeal his conviction, despite the insurmountable amount of evidence against him, and his defense team later decided they wanted a different psychiatrist to evaluate him. In the end, his appeals for a new psychiatric evaluation and for a reduced sentence were both rejected, and he was told that he would have to make peace with the 30-year sentence that had originally been handed down. With all this said, it's unlikely Orlando will ever return to the US, since he still has an outstanding warrant for his arrest, regardless of the fact that he would have already done his time overseas. This decision brought huge relief to Haley's family, who stated that they'd never seen any remorse from her killer, other than the regret that he showed at the fact that he'd been caught. The thing is, Haley had ambitions to make a difference in the lives of others, and this opportunity was taken from her by someone who only had their own best interest at heart. But her legacy has endured in the lives of those that she touched while she was still alive. Haley's mother, Karen, has stated that she's now on a mission to bring as much awareness as possible to crimes of femicide, and one of Haley's friends, Melanie Henney, is now a volunteer at an organization called RAIN, which deals with crimes that have been committed against women in the US, most often by the hands of the men in their lives. She stated that even if she saves just one woman from ending up in a situation like Haley's, she'll be satisfied. It's a sentiment that should be commonplace, but the sad reality is that many women suffer at the hands of jealous partners on a daily basis, and a large portion of them never make it out. They're subjected to fear, assault, manipulation, and in the worst cases, have their lives stolen from them by people who just don't understand that each of our decisions is our own to make, regardless of anyone else's viewpoints on the matter. Unfortunately, it's impossible to predict when obsession will turn into something even more sinister. But what we can do is ensure that the women in our lives, and men for that matter, have a solid support system provided by the ones they love, and that their fears and complaints are not only heard, but acted upon when necessary. Unfortunately, though, it's impossible to govern someone else's life, and the decisions they make at the end of the day remain their own. It was a warm summer's day when Brenda Delgado received an email from her former boyfriend. The two had been happily dating for a number of years. Ricky had even given her a promise ring. Detectives say that in February of that same year, Ricky decided to break things off. He just wasn't happy anymore. The two remained friends, and by June, Ricky sent Brenda an email announcing he'd finally begun dating someone else, a lovely young woman named Kendra Hatcher. The only problem was, while Ricky had happily moved on with his life, Brenda, well, she hadn't. Hearing this news was devastating, and investigators say that Brenda vowed to get Ricky back no matter the cost, and she was willing to take down anything and everyone who stood in her way. In September of 2015, Kendra's life was about as perfect as she could have ever imagined. She'd been growing up and earning her wings as a dentist in Pleasant Plains, Illinois, and she moved to Dallas, Texas to get a fresh start. While most people with a dentistry degree would jump at the chance of opening their own practice after their long years of study, in contrast, the choices that Kendra made revealed a lot about who she was as a person. Instead of setting out on her own, she joined an organization known as Smile Zone, where she would provide children from less advantaged homes with high-quality dentistry, and she knew that here she could make a difference in her community. Even when she wasn't bettering the lives of the disadvantaged, Kendra would use much of her spare time teaching people about the Bible, and she even joined a program that focused on building churches in other countries. If this wasn't great enough, The organization even offered free dental services to children living in Ecuador. It's safe to say Kendra was a very selfless person who always had the best interest of others in mind. But earlier that year in May, her life had gotten even richer when she met a man named Ricky Paniagua on Tinder, and by September, the couple had fallen hopelessly in love. Kendra's home was located in an upper-class part of Dallas, specifically on Gables Park 17, on the corner of Cedar Springs and Ackerd. It was a place where she felt at ease since there were plenty of security cameras watching the property, along with a 24-hour concierge service. Residents even had access to secure parking in a heavily monitored parking garage. Ricky was also doing well professionally, as he was in the midst of completing his dermatology residency at the University of Texas. And he and Kendra had gone as far as discussing marriage, despite only dating for 4 months. Now, this may seem early, but they found that they were a perfect match with similar morals and their ideals very much aligned. In essence, they thought of themselves as the perfect couple. Kendra was described as kind, beautiful, and always willing to lend a hand to anyone in need. She'd worked hard to create the life that she was living, and poured her heart and soul not only into her work, but into her relationship with Ricky. But as is so often the case, one person's success and happiness can cause untold strife for someone else. Jealousy is a bitter pill to swallow. Unfortunately, this jealousy led to a tragic crime that would change Ricky's life forever and end with Kendra losing hers. On Wednesday, the 2nd of September, Kendra had finished her shift at Smile Zone and headed home to Gables Park 17. She was looking forward to the weekend since she and Ricky had made plans to travel to Mexico for Labor Day, which is a holiday for workers here in the US. She was super excited at the prospect of discussing plans for she and Ricky to move to San Francisco when they got back. But she could never have foreseen what would happen next when she arrived at her building at exactly 7:42 p.m. After arriving home, she drove her car into the secure parking garage and parked in her usual spot. But just minutes later, 2 witnesses who were present in the garage heard a woman screaming, followed by the blood-curdling sound of a firearm being discharged. A fellow resident at the complex, a man named Hashem Saad, also heard the same sounds and instantly knew something was wrong. He called 911 and reported what he'd heard, despite not knowing exactly what had happened or who was involved. But before he did so, witnesses saw a Jeep Cherokee leaving the parking lot at full speed, though they weren't certain whether it was connected to the alarming sounds that they'd heard or if someone was just in a hurry. The police were quick to respond, but no amount of haste could have changed what they found at the scene when they arrived. When detectives finally made it to the scene of the crime, Kendra had unfortunately already lost her life. Prior to this, there was no suspicion that anyone had any ill will towards Kendra. After all, who could? She was near about as good of a person as any of us could hope to be. When investigators began looking around the scene of the crime, they quickly noticed that her purse was missing. Her purse couldn't be found in her car or anywhere in the garage, so it was quickly assumed that she'd been robbed and that the crime had somehow gone wrong, resulting in her assailant ending her life. Close to the area where she was found, a handgun magazine was collected for evidence, along with shards from its ammunition. But when investigators started processing the scene further, they uncovered some very shocking clues. As more and more evidence was collected, they were now of the opinion that this crime was planned. They believed the scene was staged to look like a robbery, and this was evident from GSR residue that was found on Kendra's hands, indicating that she had her hands behind her head at the moment that she was fired at. Furthermore, the path that the bullet had taken suggested her assailant was standing behind her when they fired the shot, and that she was on her knees, likely having been forced to kneel, which isn't something that happens during a typical robbery. Cops were at a loss as to who would put this innocent woman through such awful torment. It just wasn't fair. But for the assailant, everything was going to plan. After clearing the scene of the crime, detectives had the unfortunate task of breaking the news to Kendra's boyfriend, Ricky. Ricky was understandably devastated at the news, and later that night he sent a text message to his former girlfriend and longtime friend, Brenda Delgado. Brenda was shocked to hear the news of Kendra's passing, and she vowed to be there for Ricky any time, day or night. As the investigation into this baffling crime continued, investigators looked at security footage from Kendra's building, and they were immediately presented with a fair amount of evidence regarding the Jeep Cherokee that was seen leaving the garage immediately after the shots were fired. It showed the vehicle arriving at the building at 7:15 p.m., 28 minutes before Kendra drove into the garage. Footage inside the garage captured a man who could be seen walking towards the area where Kendra's car was parked, and he would then be seen returning to the Jeep just a short while later. Investigators were certain that this man was responsible for the crime, but they didn't recognize him or the Jeep that he was seen in. It would then come to light that the man hadn't acted alone, as a woman could be seen driving the Jeep mere moments after the man got back in, and it had become clear that this incident had been planned well ahead of time. Footage of the scene wasn't clear enough to identify the two suspects, or to see the Jeep's license plate number, and so investigators decided to release still images of the security footage to the public, along with an appeal for anyone who recognized the couple to come forward. In these types of circumstances, it's often the case that these bids for information go unanswered, either because no one can identify the suspects, or because people are simply too scared to come forward for fear that they might be retaliated against. But in Kendra's case, the exact opposite was true. Very soon after this information was released, Jose Luis Ortiz came forward with a startling confession that the Jeep in the footage was his, but he was adamant that he was not present when the crime was committed, and that he had no idea that his car would become the focus of a true crime investigation. Now, normally, investigators would be skeptical about such claims, but Luis Ortiz had more information that would help set the investigation on the right track, the details of which are not only tragic, but infuriating. Surprisingly, when detectives spoke with Jose, the first name that was mentioned was that of Brenda Delgado, Ricky's ex-girlfriend, who was described by her family as a wholesome, loving person who held fast to her Christian beliefs and morals, and who was part of a loving family. He stated that she and another woman, 26-year-old Crystal Cortez, had approached him on the morning of September 2nd to ask if he could work on Cortez's car, since it had a problem with the engine. He agreed, and when they asked if they could borrow his Jeep for the day, he was all too happy to help out. He knew that the two women had to get to work, and so he felt that he'd be doing them a favor. They arranged to meet back at Jose's place after they were finished at work, but later that day, these plans suddenly changed. While waiting for the Jeep to be returned, he received a call from Brenda, who asked if it would be okay for them to meet at a local Chili's restaurant instead. This seemed like an innocent enough request, and he agreed. But when he arrived, he was perplexed to find that the car wasn't there, and neither was Crystal. The two women would return his Jeep to him later that same evening, but by now he had already learned that Kendra's life had been ended, and that his car had been used during the crime. Before contacting the police, Luis Ortiz had confronted Brenda about the still images that were released, and she reassured him that it was a different vehicle that was caught on camera. It was a mere coincidence that it just happened to look exactly like his own. But she would then change her story and admit that Crystal had indeed driven the Jeep to Kendra's building, since she was supposed to pick up illegal goods for a friend. It's safe to say Jose was not very happy about this. She assumed that something must have gone wrong in the process, and that Kendra had either gotten involved or lost her life as an innocent bystander. And it was then that he knew he had to come forward, since the identification of his Jeep could have had severe consequences. Jose told the police that after confessing to what the Jeep had actually been used for, Brenda urged him to keep quiet, stating that he could lose his U.S. citizenship if the police found out that he was somehow involved in a crime, even though he wasn't. To ensure that his name would be kept out of the investigation, she suggested that he have the Jeep resprayed in a different color, and she even offered to pay for this to be done. But this only further aroused his suspicions, since he could tell that Brenda was being manipulative, and he knew that he immediately had to clear his name as quickly as possible by confessing to the police, and that's exactly what he did. Police immediately set out to track down Brenda. When they finally brought her in for questioning, she claimed she'd never even heard Kendra's name before, and that she had no idea who she was, adding that she had a solid alibi for the time when Kendra was attacked. She supplied investigators with receipts from the Chili's restaurant and stated that Jose would confirm that she was there at that exact time, as they'd had dinner together. Brenda then said if they wanted to catch who was really responsible, they should look more closely at Crystal, telling the police that she was with her when they got the Jeep from Jose, but that she let Crystal use the Jeep for the rest of the day. Next, they approached Crystal to get her side of the story, and she had quite the tale to tell. She confessed that she was indeed the driver seen in the parking garage's security footage, but added that she had driven there under duress with her young son in the back, as they'd been carjacked by an armed man who ordered her to drive to Kendra's building. But this was so obviously a lie. Investigators knew that this wasn't true since they'd studied the security footage thoroughly, and at no point had anyone seen a child in the car. They immediately confronted her about this lie, but Crystal quickly came up with a different version of events. Not a very wise move when you're in the presence of seasoned detectives. But she now claimed that she'd agreed to drive the man to the building so that he could carry out a robbery, but it was all at the request of her good friend, Brenda. But she insisted that she knew nothing about the crime that took place and that she had no idea that someone had lost their life in the process. At this point, Crystal had now confessed that she was an accomplice, but she refused to go down alone, as she'd now implicated Brenda, stating that she'd only agreed to take part in the robbery at her request. She then explained that Brenda wanted the man to rob Kendra since she was jealous of the fact that her old boyfriend, Ricky, was now dating her. And the case was now starting to make a lot more sense. And it was soon revealed that when Brenda found out that Ricky and Kendra were dating, she found it impossible to accept. Police were now on to something, but let me tell you, this is only the tip of the iceberg. It was clear Brenda still had deep feelings for Ricky, but she would never have admitted this to him. Instead, she found ways to keep tabs on him, and the details of these activities are enough to send chills down anyone's spine. When Ricky had dated other women after ending his relationship with Brenda, it was only when he met Kendra that Brenda knew this relationship would be a long-term one. Since Ricky and Brenda had kept tabs over the months following their relationship, Ricky felt that it was the decent thing to do to send Brenda an email and let her know that he was now in a committed relationship. Brenda gave him the impression that she was happy for him, and even suggested that they continued being friends. In Ricky's mind, this would have been a very mature response, and he must have been delighted that she took the news so well. But unbeknownst to him, Brenda was actually shattered by the news, and it seemingly had a very serious effect on her, since she then started making plans, along with Crystal, to have Kendra removed from the picture. While Brenda kept as many details as possible a secret, Crystal had quickly realized just how much trouble they were in, and she decided to become a witness for the prosecution, in hopes that she would receive a lighter sentence for her involvement. She revealed that she and Brenda had started making their nefarious plans just 2 weeks after they met, when Brenda revealed to her that she wanted Kendra out of Ricky's life, even if it meant ending her life. This would have been enough to deter most people from continuing the friendship, but strangely, Crystal was immediately on board. It was clear early on that Brenda had become completely obsessed with Ricky and Kendra's relationship, to the point where it was affecting her everyday life. She'd failed to show up for several of her shifts at work, since she was too busy keeping track of Ricky, especially after she managed to gain access to his email account, and learned that they'd been making plans not only to go on vacation together, but to start their lives together. She told Crystal that she felt as though Kendra was an imposter who had taken her place, giving us some serious insight into the rapidly deteriorating state of mind that she was in. With every passing day, her ill feelings toward Kendra only grew, and Brenda eventually made up her mind that the only way to get Ricky back was to claw Kendra out of the picture. First, she approached her cousin, Moses Martinez, and asked him if he would be willing to attack Kendra with a baseball bat, but he rightfully refused. Unwilling to give up, she then spoke to a friend of hers, Jennifer Escobar, with whom she proposed the same thing, somehow convincing herself that such an attack would leave Kendra in a coma, and that she could then start working to get Ricky back. Jennifer also refused. By this time, Brenda had already broken into Ricky's email account, and she was spending most of her time reading through his correspondence and keeping track of his movements. Jennifer knew that Brenda had become obsessed and was perturbed by the fact that she still had a copy of the keys to his house, and even still had access to Ricky's bank accounts, all unbeknownst to him. When Jennifer refused to take part in her plans, Brenda suggested that instead of using a baseball bat, she could inject Kendra with something fatal, offering to give her a car, the substance that she would use to get the job done, as well as $2,000 for her troubles. But Jennifer once again refused. It was then that Brenda and Crystal met up. It would come to light that Crystal looked up to her new friend since she had a steady job, her own place, and made decent money, whereas Crystal was struggling to make ends meet as a single mother, who, despite working hard, didn't make much money at all. When the two women started planning the attack, Brenda gave Crystal $500 to help her out, as was evidenced by an ATM withdrawal slip that was later found among Brenda's possessions. But they now needed to find someone who'd be willing to get their hands dirty. And they started driving around the area where Crystal lived, since it was known to have a bad reputation. If they were going to find someone to do the job, this would be the place. Remarkably, they approached several people, all of whom declined their offer. It's just so wild to me that these two women literally just drove around a local neighborhood begging someone to claim someone's life. That's just wild to me. But the two eventually met a 31-year-old man named Christopher Love. He seemed more than willing to go through with the crime and even discussed different ways in which they could end Kendra's life. But they eventually decided that a firearm would be the best option, since the crime could be committed quickly. Christopher would receive cash and illegal substances as payment. It was told by Brenda that she would introduce him to her cartel connections, to which he happily agreed. Having gone through Ricky's emails, Brenda knew that he and Kendra would be leaving for their vacation to Mexico that weekend. And having also learned that they would be making plans to move away upon their return, well, Brenda announced that the crime needed to be committed, and it needed to be committed right now. While Christopher awaited instructions from Brenda and Crystal followed Kendra to learn what her everyday routine was like. They learned where she worked, and on one occasion used binoculars to spy on her while she was in her office, all while they were sitting across the street at a Salvation Army charity store. That afternoon, they followed her as she drove home and realized they could get into the building's parking garage by waiting outside and following one of the other residents as they drove in. The gate allowed just enough time for this to be possible. When they were certain of Kendra's routine after following her for a few days, they were confident that their plan would work, and on the 1st of September, the three accomplices did a dry run to ensure that everyone knew what they were supposed to do the next day. The following morning, Brenda and Crystal borrowed the Jeep from Jose. They then picked up Christopher, after which they dropped Brenda off at the Carrollton Library. Christopher and Crystal then traveled to Smile Zone, at which point Crystal actually left Christopher there since she had to pick up her son and nephew from school. She then dropped them off at her grandmother's house before returning to finish the job. The two then spotted Kendra leaving work after her shift, but lost her in traffic and ended up arriving at her building before she did. They managed to make it to the parking garage, where they awaited to ambush her, and when she arrived, Christopher got out of the Jeep and followed through with the plan, all while Crystal stayed out of sight. They then made their getaway, drove to Christopher's house, where he was dropped off, and Crystal then took the Jeep back to Jose. The entire plot was revealed to police by Crystal, all as part of the plea deal she made with the prosecution. In exchange for her cooperation, Crystal was given 35 years behind bars rather than a life sentence. Though that's not much of an improvement if you ask me, though you do have to admit she'll probably not even serve half that time before she's paroled. When Christopher realized that he'd been caught after the gun used in the crime was found in his car, he also openly admitted to his role, and Brenda was the mastermind behind the entire plan. But despite being willing to provide all the details of the crime to investigators, they didn't need him anymore. Crystal had already mapped out the entire plan for them. Christopher was then sentenced to capital punishment, since he was the one who actually carried out the crime of ending Kendra's life. By now, there was just one more missing piece to the puzzle: Brenda. She'd put all these events into motion due to her refusal to accept that Ricky was happy in his new relationship. Once Brenda caught wind of how much trouble she was in, she decided to go on the run rather than face the consequences of her own heinous actions. During the 7 months that she remained on the run, she was placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, and a $100,000 reward was offered for information leading to her arrest. But she was eventually tracked down in Mexico, where she was taken into custody in April of the following year. She would then be extradited back to the US under the condition that she wouldn't face the death penalty. She pleaded not guilty to all charges, insisting that she had an alibi for the time when the crime was committed. But she didn't. There was no doubt in the minds of the jury that Brenda was the one who orchestrated the attack on Kendra, and they found her guilty, handing down a sentence of life in prison, and she'll never be eligible for parole. This heartbreaking crime should have never been committed. That much is obvious. And thanks to the jealous nature of one person, Kendra's family's lives have been irrevocably changed for the worse, and even some of her co-workers have been badly affected by her loss. Tammy Potano was a close friend who had studied with Kendra and had remained friends with her after they graduated, and she stated that she now finds it hard to just be carefree and happy. You never know what may be lurking around the corner. She says that she's no longer as sociable as she used to be in the past, and this is likely due not only to heartbreak, but also fear. She added that the crime has had a negative impact on her marriage, and that many other people have been deeply affected as well, including patients who knew Kendra. Her patients were also struggling to come to terms with the fact that such a loving and caring person had lost her life at the hands of 3 people who'd never even met her, never even spoken a single word to her. When obsession and jealousy creep into someone's mind, there's no telling what the result might be. And in most cases, someone in that situation would eventually make peace with the fact that they need to move on with their lives. But Brenda Delgado refused to accept that she couldn't have what she wanted, and in the end, she'll pay the price for the rest of her life. But even with this exchange, it doesn't even begin to make up for such a loss of an amazing young woman like Kendra Hatcher.
It doesn't just feel like I lost a piece of myself. It's more like I lost memories I could have had with you.
These are the words spoken by Gwen Gabe, the father of 24-year-old Alexis Gabe, at a memorial in her honor almost a year after she suddenly disappeared in January of 2022. The true crime story of Alexis Gabe is one filled with strange evidence, bizarre twists and turns, and details that her family and investigators are still struggling to come to terms with, and many questions remain unanswered, as the man believed to be responsible for her disappearance refused to divulge any information he had, and ultimately lost his life at the hands of police. Alexis Gabe was taken down by one of the people she trusted most, one of her closest friends. The problem is, no one knows why. Thankfully, this case has finally been solved, but the real search for answers, well, it's only just begun. Alexis's parents, Gwen and Rowena Gabe, met while they were still children growing up in the Philippines. But in 1986, when Gwen was 16 years old, they lost contact when Gwen's family decided to relocate to the US. It would be many years before they saw each other again, but they were able to reconnect when Gwen and his family returned to the Philippines for a vacation. This time, they stayed in touch. In 1994, they decided to get married. They moved to Antioch, California, before ultimately settling in Oakley, where they raised a family of 3 children, Alexis being the middle child and their only daughter. Growing up, Alexis was a happy and creative girl who found joy in fashion, drawing, and photography. Alexis was a girl who wouldn't let anything keep her down. She always tried hard to find the best in a bad situation, and this was a personality trait that would follow her throughout her life. After graduating from Liberty High School in Brentwood, she attended the Contra Costa Medical College in Antioch and graduated as a qualified EKG technician, someone who helps patients who are suffering from severe heart conditions. It doesn't seem like Alexis was ever able to put her degree to work because just after leaving school, she started working at a Rite Aid pharmacy, where, according to some of the customers that she dealt with, she was always ready to greet anyone with a smile and put their needs first. It's clear that even those who only knew Alexis in passing knew that she was an incredibly bright and caring young woman. As time passed by, Alexis met a man named Marshall Jones, and the two started dating. But at some point, their relationship broke down, but the specifics of this are unclear. The two remained friends and would still hang out on occasion. The relationship ended relatively smoothly, and neither of the two had any bad blood with the other. Or so it would seem. See, while Alexis seems as though she was ready and willing to move on from their relationship, Marshall wasn't. It's unclear if Marshall was just deeply in love with Alexis or if he was merely obsessed over her for other reasons. But Marshall made a promise to himself that, one way or the other, he wasn't letting Alexis get away. It was the 26th of January, 2022, when one of Alexis's friends spoke to her through a FaceTime call at around 6 p.m. She would later tell investigators that Alexis seemed to be sitting in her car, presumably in the parking lot at work. About 20 minutes later, she was seen by security cameras at a Chevron gas station on Lone Tree Way in Brentwood. Alexis then left the gas station and traveled to Marshall Jones's house, her now ex-boyfriend, which was located on Bent Tree Way. Now, fair warning, a lot of the street names in this story have to do with trees or ways, so it can be a bit hard to follow at times, but I'll do my best to make sure that everything's as clear as possible. After arriving on Bent Tree Way, Alexis's car's data history suggests that it was turned off at exactly 6:32 p.m. It's believed that this is the time that she arrived at Marshall Jones's house, and her cell phone records show that she remained in that area for quite some time. Alexis's father attempted to contact her at around 7:30 that evening, just about 1 hour after she arrived to meet up with Marshall, but she never picked up the phone. He wasn't too concerned about this at first because Alexis was always in the habit of staying out late. Most of the time, Gwen would wait up for her, but on this particular day, he and his wife had both caught COVID, and so they went to bed earlier than they normally would. Later that night, at 9:23 p.m., Alexis's GPS showed that her car had started up, and both it and her cell phone left Lone Tree Way. The car then traveled to Oakley, which wouldn't be particularly unusual, except for the route that it followed. Alexis had a very specific route that she usually drove from Antioch to Oakley, and this was the first time that the GPS showed her deviating from that route. Finally, the car came to a stop on Trenton Street, where it was turned off at around 9:35 p.m., and it didn't move again after this. The only problem was, her cell phone did. The person driving the car exited the vehicle and was seen by security cameras walking along Oakley Road and Belden Lane with Alexis's cell phone in their possession. The only problem was, the person seen in the footage, it wasn't Alexis. Less than 5 minutes later, after this unidentified person of interest was captured on CCTV, Alexis's phone was turned off and the person carrying it walked to Live Oak Road, arriving there at about 10:06 p.m. They would eventually walk under Laurel Pass, make their way to the same Chevron gas station where Alexis was seen earlier that night, and then walk towards Cedar Point Way. Marshall Jones, Alexis's ex-boyfriend, had phone records showing that he messaged Alexis at 11:16 p.m. that night, asking whether she got home safely, and when there was no reply, he called her number about 20 minutes later. But since her phone was turned off by this point, there was no answer. The following morning, her family was surprised to find that Alexis still wasn't home. She'd been given the responsibility to make sure that her 15-year-old brother made it to school on time every day, and she would pick him up at the end of each school day. She'd been doing this for months. So when she suddenly didn't show up to take him to school, well, her parents were naturally worried. When her brother realized that she was late that morning, he sent her a text message asking where she was, but he got no reply. Her father immediately became concerned, since this wasn't something Alexis would normally do, and hence he called Marshall to see if he knew where she was. Marshall stated that Alexis had been at his house the previous evening, but that she left at around 9 p.m. after deciding to go to her best friend's house. The next logical step was to call Alexis's friend. But this is where the case takes a sinister turn. Her friend told Alexis's family that she was in Sacramento and that Alexis knew she was there, so she would never have planned on visiting her at home. Unable to leave the house thanks to battling COVID, her parents asked their oldest son to go to the police station to file a missing person report. In the meantime, they contacted all of their daughter's friends and each of their relatives to see if anyone had seen her, but no one had. Family and friends quickly gathered together to start searching for her by driving around the area to see if they could spot her or her car. And their efforts paid off quickly. Alexis's car was found abandoned where it had been parked the previous night, in an area just 5 minutes from the family's home. Alarmingly, the driver's side door was found to be unlocked, and the keys were still in the ignition, something Alexis would never do. A search of the immediate area was carried out with the help of Alexis's parents. By this point, her parents were so concerned that they decided to ignore the stay-at-home orders during their battle with COVID, and they opted to leave the house anyway in search of their daughter. But unfortunately, despite their best efforts, no sign of Alexis was found. Security footage from the intersection of Trenton Street and Carrington Drive, where her car was found parked, showed a male suspect driving Alexis's car into the area before abandoning it and walking away. Now, keep in mind that whoever left the car there also had Alexis's phone with them, and hence they were likely responsible for her disappearance, since they would have likely come forward if this wasn't the case. Investigators estimated that the man was about 5'11" tall, and revealed that he was wearing an oversized jacket and had a mask over his face, though it failed to hide the fact that he had a beard. What's interesting about this is that these descriptions almost perfectly align with Marshall Jones, Alexis's ex-boyfriend. Detectives didn't have a whole lot to go on at this point, but with this newfound information, they decided it was best to keep their options open while keeping a very close eye on Marshall. And that's exactly what they did. During an interview with investigators, Marshall reiterated the timeline that he'd given to Gwen and Rowena the previous day, stating that Alexis had been at his house the previous evening, but that she left at around 9 p.m. after deciding to go to her best friend's house. He gave investigators permission to search his house with the exception of the bedrooms, which, if you ask me, isn't much of a search. If there's anything in a home worth finding, chances are it's going to be found in one of the bedrooms. The only problem was, at this point, police didn't have enough evidence against Marshall to secure a warrant. So if he said they couldn't go into those rooms, they had no choice but to obey his wishes. Marshall also handed over his phone so that it could be analyzed by a forensic team. And once this was done, he traveled to his mother's house on Bent Tree Way. And this is where things get pretty strange. Once he arrived at his mother's house, he backed his SUV into the driveway and started unloading several large trash bags from the back of it. This was evidenced by a surveillance camera that recorded short clips of his movements. Following this, he went to the Oakley Police Department where he picked up his phone and then went back to his mother's house where he picked up the bags that he'd removed from his car and placed them back inside, all while his mother was hosting a karaoke party inside the house, supposedly blissfully unaware of his suspicious activity. He and his mother then left the house together and went to a Metro PCS cell phone store, where Marshall bought a new phone and even got a new phone number. Keep in mind that while all this was going on, Alexis remained missing, and her friends and family were desperately trying to locate her. But Marshall never made any attempt to look for her. Interestingly, even though Marshall got a new phone number and a new phone, he kept his old phone and his old number active. Marshall visited his sister later that evening and left her house at about 7:11 p.m. He still had both of his phones with him, but one was turned off at 6:40 p.m. and the other was turned off at 7:11 as he left his sister's house. But before 9 o'clock that night, one of the phones was turned back on for a brief period, and phone records showed that it was in the vicinity of Bradshaw and Jackson Roads. Surveillance footage would later be found showing a vehicle similar to Marshall's being driven on Bradshaw Road, then suddenly turning on to Jackson Road, giving police a very accurate play-by-play of Marshall's movements from that evening. It's believed that Marshall made a wrong turn at one point and then turned his phone on to use its GPS function. In fact, investigators would later state that when they drove to Pioneer, they also missed the turnoff just as Marshall had. When his phone was turned back on again the next day at 12:43, it showed that Marshall was about 16 miles from Antioch, and he then drove back to his mother's house, arriving there at about 1 p.m. He only spent a short while there and then traveled back to his sister's house where it's believed he spent the rest of the day. Now, Marshall was supposed to report to work the following day, but he called his boss to say that he was taking a personal day since he, quote, had something to take care of. The next day, for reasons that remain unclear, his sister asked him to leave her house, and he was later seen on surveillance footage carrying around, of all things, an extended firearm magazine, which came completely out of left field. That same day, searchers found a broken screen belonging to an iPhone 11 Pro, the same phone that Alexis owned, but the rest of the phone was nowhere to be found. The screen was collected and sent in for a forensic analysis, and wouldn't you know it, when the results came in, Marshall's DNA was found all over the screen. By now, investigators were certain that Marshall knew way more than he was letting on, and they applied for a search warrant of his mother's house on Bent Tree. During the search, luminol showed that blood was present inside the lid of a washing machine. This sample was sent to a lab for testing, and it would later reveal that it contained Alexis's DNA. They also noticed that the shower curtains from the bathroom were missing, and when Marshall's car was searched, they found more of Alexis's DNA in the back, though it was never determined whether this stemmed from blood or a different source. The day after the search, Marshall boarded a plane in California and traveled all the way to Washington, where he then stayed with his father for a few days. An awfully convenient time to take a trip to check up on family. On the 3rd of February, just 2 days later, a search was conducted of his mother's house, but it was never revealed whether or not detectives found anything else of interest here. Later on that month, a search warrant was granted for a search of Marshall's sister's house, And here, investigators found a handwritten note containing directions to Pioneer. They believed this handwriting belonged to Marshall, and it seemed as though he'd been documenting a journey he'd taken to Pioneer just a short while ago. But why? The note specified when to turn right or left along the way, as well as the time it would take to drive between each of these points. And this alone was a pretty suspicious thing to note down. When this was discovered, investigators theorized that Marshall must have ended Alexis's life and then drove to this specific area to dispose of her body. But now they needed to prove it. Search parties immediately drove to the area, detailed in the note, to see what they could find. They were accompanied by land, air, and water search teams, as well as canine units, sonar specialists, helicopter, and dive teams. 2 days after the search was started, a search volunteer came across Alexis's cell phone case on Vista Grand Drive and Bent Tree Way. There's no doubt that it belonged to Alexis, since it was a one-of-a-kind, hand-drawn case. When it was processed, Alexis's DNA was found to be present, further proving that it must have belonged to her. A nearby pond was searched after it was completely drained, since sonar devices returned some strange data. Sniffer dog units were also on standby after the dogs had reacted to something in the water. But after going through all that effort to drain and search the pond, nothing of interest was found, and it's unclear why the dogs had alerted their handlers to this location. While all of this must have been incredibly confusing and frustrating for investigators, we have to remember this must have been a torturous time for Alexis's family, as they were receiving nothing but small pieces of heartbreaking information. And putting them all together, a larger picture started to emerge that pointed to a tragic and bitter ending for Alexis. Alexis's family had now become convinced that Marshall's mother also knew more than she was letting on. And on the 19th of May, Alicia Clark, his mother, was arrested and charged with aiding and abetting. But she was released just a short while later after it was found there wasn't enough evidence to prove that she knew anything about Alexis's disappearance, nor her son's potential involvement in her supposed demise. While all of this was being discovered, the Oakley City Council decided to offer a $10,000 reward to anyone who came forward with information on Alexis's disappearance. An anonymous donor later added an extra $50,000 to that amount, and in May of 2022, the council added a further $40,000 to that amount, bringing the reward to $100,000. It had now become apparent to everyone involved in Alexis's case that Marshall had something to do with her disappearance. And investigators suggested that he ended her life on the night that she visited him, though it isn't clear why he chose to do so. As far as anyone knew, the two had ended their relationship on good terms and remained good friends with one another. So what could have gone so horribly wrong that it would prompt Marshall to take Alexis's life? Police believe that whatever took place, Marshall took Alexis's life and then placed her body in the back of his SUV, then drove to a remote location where he left her remains. But at this point, detectives didn't have any way of knowing where Alexis's remains could be found. And so they decided to apply for a search warrant, which was to be served at Marshall's father's house in Washington. Thankfully, the warrant was granted, and on the 1st of June, the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office and the United States Marshals Service were tasked with executing the search. The only problem was, the search did not have the expected outcome. Marshall knew that investigators were hot on his trail. While he hadn't admitted anything up to this point, it's pretty clear Marshall knew far more about this case than he was willing to admit. When investigators showed up at his father's home, they did their best to coerce Marshall out of the home, but he wasn't willing to budge. He knew that if he stepped 1 foot out that front door, he would be arrested. And the thing was, he was right. But no one could have expected the tragedy that was about to unfold. Police body cam footage of the incident shows officers trying to convince Marshall to leave the house peacefully, with some carrying shields for their own protection. But Marshall seemingly had no plans of going down peacefully, and he can be seen suddenly emerging from the house with a large kitchen knife in his hand. And it became clear at this point, things were not about to end well. One officer can be heard ordering Marshall to drop the knife, but instead he lunges forward in an attempt to get to the officer, and they unfortunately had no choice but to open fire, ending Marshall's life in the process, as well as any hopes of gathering information about Alexis's disappearance. This must have been incredibly disheartening for Alexis's family, as they still had no idea where Marshall left her body, no idea what even happened to her, And now their main suspect couldn't even be put on trial for what he had allegedly done. Any hopes of getting answers from Marshall had slipped away, and it would be up to investigators alone to bring this case to a close. But that would be much easier said than done. On the 2nd of June, a press conference was held, during which investigators announced that Marshall had lost his life at the hands of police, and a full explanation was given of the events leading up to this unfortunate turn of events. Most of this altercation was captured on police body cams and CCTV, so there's little debate regarding what actually happened to Marshall that day. Alexis's father spoke at this conference and reiterated that he and his family couldn't believe that Marshall was capable of hurting their daughter, since he was her first love and since they'd been together for 3 years up until splitting up. As mentioned before, the two were still very good friends, and no one ever expected that their relationship would take such an unnecessary and tragic turn. Well, no one except for one man, it seems. One of Marshall's friends, whose name has never been revealed to the public, came forward to speak to investigators about a strange conversation he had with Marshall about 2 weeks before Alexis disappeared. In a very surprising turn of events, his friend revealed that Marshall approached him one day and stated that he was thinking of ending Alexis's life, though he didn't say why. He then asked whether his friend knew of any good places where he could hide her body after the deed was done. Marshall was completely upfront about this, totally out in the open, but his friend couldn't figure out why in the world Marshall would want to do something like this. Rather than go to the police, his friend suggested that a septic tank would be a good hiding spot, or that he should think about burying her in a remote forest somewhere. When asked why he decided to remain quiet about this, rather than report what Marshall had told him to the police, he stated that he thought Marshall was kidding around and that he never thought he would actually go through with ending her life. In essence, he thought that Marshall was just upset with her, and this was some sort of dark joke or some way to blow off steam. Obviously, this is not something that any parent ever wants to hear, and to learn that their daughter's passing could have been avoided if this man had just come forward immediately after Marshall approached him, well, it must be a gut-wrenching moment, and I can only imagine what thoughts must have been going through the minds of Alexis's family at this point. This one man could have helped save their daughter's life, but because of either a miscommunication or maybe even fear, he didn't. But as was the case with Marshall's friend, there's no way of telling what's going on in someone's mind, and I'd like to think that if he thought Marshall was serious about ending Alexis's life, he would have come forward. But at this point, it was all too late. All that Gwen and Rowena and the rest of Alexis's family could do now was just keep searching, in hopes that they could somehow find their daughter's remains. But it would ultimately be someone completely unconnected to the case who would contact police when they made a very grim discovery. The resident of Plymouth, California, was using a metal detector in a remote area off of Jackson Road when he stumbled across what he believed to be human remains and immediately contacted the local sheriff's office. When investigators traveled to the site, they realized that this man had in fact stumbled across partial human remains. Police immediately suspected they likely belonged to Alexis, considering the location in which they were found. All they needed to do now was confirm this theory. But this wouldn't take as long as you might have thought, because they soon found more evidence at the same site, including earrings that her family identified as hers. They were even able to provide photos of Alexis wearing these exact earrings. Police also found remnants of the garbage bags that Marshall was seen unloading and loading from his car, along with pieces of duct tape that he must have used to secure the bags while he was transporting them. The rest of the area was thoroughly searched, but nothing further was found. What's particularly shocking here is when investigating the contents of the bags, as well as the remains that were found by the metal detector, well, it painted a very grim picture of Alexis's final moments. That's because Alexis's remains weren't just found in one bag or in one location. There were multiple pieces of this puzzle. Police speculated that the rest of Alexis's remains must have been scattered in different areas, though they were unable to determine whether this was done by Marshall or by wildlife in the area. Though the most probable theory is the former, considering the multiple bags he was seen unloading and loading at his mother's house. Unfortunately, police now had the daunting task of informing Alexis's family that their daughter had finally been found, but certainly not how anyone had hoped. In the wake of this, Alexis's father made a public statement, saying, "Despite all the pain, anger, frustration, and grief, we're somehow relieved that she's been found, and we can finally bring her home." He thanked everyone who helped search for his daughter for the 9 months since she disappeared. But the weight of this revelation, it was clearly not what the family wanted to hear. Thanks to the earrings found in Plymouth, it was all but certain that the remains that were found belonged to Alexis. The only problem was, a coroner couldn't say with any certainty how Alexis had lost her life. The case had finally run its full course, but for Alexis's family, there was no closure. Gwynn stated that he and the rest of Alexis's family would continue searching for the rest of her remains. And in January of 2023, a group of more than 700 searchers set out once again in an effort to locate them. This time they were successful, as another set of remains was located, but sadly it's unlikely that any more will ever be found. DNA tests were carried out on the newly discovered remains, and they were confirmed to belong to Alexis, but no one knows how many other locations her remains may still be scattered in. And it's just so devastating for the Gabe family to know that such a terrible, awful end can be forced upon someone who did literally nothing wrong. In March of 2023, Alexis's friends and family gathered on what would have been her 25th birthday to celebrate her life. And while they were saddened that she wasn't there with them, they were able to honor her by dedicating a park bench in her name at the Oakley City Hall. Rowena added that the park was one of Alexis's favorite spots to visit, and she could now visit the park every day since it was just a short walk from the family's home. The case is now closed, but for Alexis's family, there's still many unanswered questions. And there's nothing that can help put their minds at ease after something like this. There's just nothing. They're adamant that Marshall didn't act alone in disposing of Alexis's body, and have reiterated on many occasions that they're of the opinion that his mother has failed to disclose certain details that no one else was privy to. But investigators, nor her family, have any way of proving Marshall's mother's involvement. There's just no evidence to link her to the case, at least none that would hold up in court. After all is said and done, one can't help but feel that this was a completely nonsense crime, committed by someone whom Alexis trusted. But that trust was betrayed in the most heinous way imaginable, especially since there doesn't seem to be any specific reason why Marshall would want to end her life. To call this crime senseless, well, that doesn't even begin to describe it.